Hello. So I think we're ready to start this live stream. A few personal delays on this side. My wife is making popcorn, and I thought it'd be a bad form to have the live stream start with a bunch of popping sounds in the background. But anyway, thank you for joining me for this very late live stream. I believe this is Distans 35. The title is probably going to be fairly confusing for people. And again, if you are in the chat and you hear this, just let me know that my sound's coming through. I don't have headphones on. I can't test this. But for people who are tuning in and who don't follow controversies in other channels, probably this, the title that I'm dealing with right now, the title you're seeing on your screen, is fairly confusing. Anyway, this is a stream that I'm going to be dedicating towards a discussion of reactionary tactics, specifically tactics that have been emerging around the idea of pacifism and some objections to pacifism. So with that, I'm just going to kind of give some background. Again, sorry for the soft start, but so obviously there's been a lot of discussion in reactionary communities around ideas about what is to be done. And there's been discussions on a variety of fronts. Currently, the most popular class of ideas has been concepts surrounding pacifism. And sorry, I don't know if I can start while things are people are moving things around on this side, and it's always hard to know how to start these things. At any rate, man, this is going to be one rough live stream, but thank you all for your patience. At any rate, given sort of the nature of politics, obviously I'm streaming this after the debate, and I didn't watch it. I didn't need to see a rerun of Grumpy Old Men, and for all accounts I saw in the little time that I had before I actually started streaming myself was that it was more or less a rehash of the original debate between Biden and Trump. At any rate, I think what's apparent for people who are on the distant right or who are on any of these reactionary circles, or increasingly even in conservative circles, we have an understanding that politics as it's classically worked is not working anymore. And because of that, people are looking for alternative strategies. Specifically, I think what people are realizing is that the kind of politics specifically that the Republican Party is practicing aren't working anymore. And because of this, people, and here I mean specifically people like Curtis Yarvin and aka Mencius Moldbug, are trying to come up with alternative ways of not only dealing with politics in an activist sense, but actually conceptualizing politics. And in this, there have been a number of pushbacks. Some of them good, some of them I'd say kind of constructive pushbacks, some of them classic criticisms. And so this stream, which I dedicated, I kind of decided I'd do a stream like this about a week back when the initial set of objections came out. And I wanted to do a deep dive on what is to be done. What are productive ways to handle politics? What are productive ways to conceptualize politics in sort of this post-political age? What are the main problems that have come up? So I think before I can, and obviously if you're wondering about the title, so the first person, the original reason for doing the stream was a Twitter user called Emily Nephilim, made a number of objections on Academic Agents stream. And I said that I would really like to take on her objections. And she said the best way to do that would be for me to do a video. And considering that live streaming is my only way to efficiently make a topical video, this is pretty much the video I decided to make. And at the same time, one of my favorite YouTubers, he YouTubes under the name The Franklin, made a series of videos, and I've been meaning to get around to this for a very, very long time. He made a series of videos broadly outlining both his problems with how classically reactionaries have conceptualized post-politics or pacifism, and his own take on what we can do or how we want to start a conversation on what to do about our situation. So before I can get on, this is kind of a weirdly structured talk, because where I usually am just addressing an idea, right now I'm addressing a criticism towards an idea. So what ideas are being criticized for people who are not familiar with ideas largely having to do with neo-reactionary or post-liberal solutions to problems in this world? And so, okay, so let's go over it. So obviously, most of the distant right political community here online, they start with the problem of politics being in many ways broken, and specifically liberal politics being broken. So as everyone knows who's gone through 9th or 10th grade civics class, we all took the courses where they bring you up there and they teach you about the executive branch and the judiciary and the legislature. And this is supposedly how we manage power in this republic, this so-called republic, we could say. There are a number of problems with this model. And of course, in addition to learning about the branches of government, you also learn about the Bill of Rights and this understanding of free speech and free discourse. And depending on when you were in high school, probably if you were in high school in the late 90s or the early 2000s, you got this concept of the free marketplace of ideas. And this is... My friend Endeavor has made a number of videos called Lies of the Enlightenment that take on each of these concepts in turn. But in the interest of brevity, pardon me, some ice there. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to have to just summarize this. The difficulty with this 9th or 10th grade civics class understanding of government and the idea of an open discourse, sort of the Karl Popper open society, is that it's kind of BS. And this has been pointed out both by reactionary thinkers like Pareto or even Marxist thinkers like Gramsci. I prefer the reactionary ones for reasons that I can get into, but it's a longer story. I think they come up with a more accurate description of how power actually works. And there's a number of ways to actually test this and see how it works. But at any rate, this idea of an open discussion, if it's even hypothetically possible, certainly is not what's going on in our current age or in our current era. Our conversation is managed by a number of institutions, largely media and largely educational institutions, that more or less curate the conversation and discussion as it goes on. And also they inform the very, very large unelected government that exists completely outside the trifecta of the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches. And when it comes to actual power and how it's divided inside modern societies, this whole 9th and 10th grade civics class understanding of politics isn't a very accurate portrayal of how things are going. For instance, I think it's very obvious, or it's obvious to me, and it's obvious to most reactionaries, most people on the distant right who look at politics, that the people represented by the Democratic Party are obviously in power. Now, if you look at the branches of government, they obviously aren't in power, right? They're essentially going to lose the court. If you look at purely who's nominated by which president, there are more people nominated by Republicans, especially if ACB gets in. They're also not in power. The Democrats aren't in power in the presidency, at least yet. They are in power in Congress. So it looks like a lock, right? It looks like the Republicans and the conservatives have power. But of course, that's not the entire story, right? The majority of the power is held in these exterior institutions that reactionaries call the cathedral. But, it's not a mystery. It's not a conspiracy. And the cathedral is comprised of other institutions that we can enumerate that have CEOs, that have specific chains of money. They're just a grouping of other institutions like Harvard, like the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these institutions entirely curate official and approved ideas. They educate all of our leaders. They educate all of our professional class. They publish all the papers. They review all the facts. And they're also almost 100% affiliated with the Democratic Party, and more broadly affiliated with the center left. And so when you have a more sophisticated understanding of politics, you understand that politics, as we've been taught how it works, from a sort of purely liberal or purely Republican point of view, small r Republican that is, it doesn't work in any ways like we've been taught. And if we're going to come up with an understanding of what's wrong in our society, we have to have a more broad view of power. We have to have a more broad understanding of how power flows. And so this is where you get people like Mencius Moldbug. This is where you get people like Nick Land, like Spandrel, like, really anyone. If you watch this channel, you probably know what I'm talking about because we talk about this issue quite a bit. Suffice to say, this country only moves in one direction, and that direction is to the left. This country also only has one curator of the official conversation, or the officially approved ideas, and those curators are 100% democratically affiliated. And in that case, it's big D Democrat. In that case, they're 100% affiliated with the center left. And so this poses a problem for people on the right. This poses a problem for people like myself who, I think you could characterize me as radical, right? And whatever that even means, right? I'm certainly not a Republican. Or be more accurate, we could say dissident right. Anybody who doesn't want to play ball with some kind of moderate left view on what's acceptable and what's not has an issue. And that is, no matter who you elect, no matter who you put into power, no matter who you actually make president or prime minister or elect as a member of parliament or a senator or whatever you call them, no matter how many Supreme Court justices we have on the bench, the discourse always moves left. And no matter how insane, and this is also true too, no matter how insane or detached from reality left-wing ideas are, the discourse also moves left. So not only do these apparatuses of power that exist externally from government have the ultimate say in what government does and where the Overton window lies, they also are moved in directions by the left that has nothing to do with reality, with how we actually talk about ideas. I think we'll get into specifics about this. Obviously, we could talk about elephants in the room, like the reality of biological sex, which is quickly becoming a thought crime to even discuss. And you can ask J.K. Rowling about this. She has a very moderate view on the need to have biological sex as a category in opposition to gender. And for this, pretty much everyone on the mainstream is practically disowned the woman at this stage. And of course, she's rich, she's powerful, she can take it. Who can't take it are everyday schlubs, like people like James Damore or anyone else who just works in corporate America, who essentially can get fired for voicing opinions very much like those voiced by J.K. Rowling. And they don't have $1 billion to fall back on, right? And if you're a real thought criminal, like, say, Laura Towler is in the UK, say, like the Sellner family is in Austria, apparently the banks can just delete your bank account. They can just say, oh, I guess you don't have that money anymore. And I'm sure they have to refund you in some sense. But that's that's a month without a line of credit? That's a month without access to your funds while that goes down? So they can essentially cut off a family from funds that they need because they don't like political opinions. I mean, and if international banks, which basically, I mean, you have a hard time not using an international bank. And even if you use a credit union, those credit unions are reliant on the same international banking systems to back up their loans, right? So it all goes back to the same place. If banks can essentially come in and say, oh, we don't like this person's opinions, so we're going to delete their personal funds and essentially bankrupt their family. Where was that on our 9th grade, 10th grade civics class? I mean, where were in that whole trifecta pyramid of executive, legislative, judiciary, where were the international banks coming in and going, okay, you can't have that opinion, we're taking away we're slashing your cards. I must have missed that. Indeed, I think we all missed that because it's apparent now, especially if you live in Europe, but increasingly if you live in America, that not only does the cathedral or the center left call the shots on what acceptable opinion is, corporate America is ever so willing to make sure that the center left opinion is enforced and deviations to that center left opinion minimized. So that being said, we have a problem because you can't win this game. If you can't win this game when banks slash your account for wrongthink, you can't win this game when no matter how many Supreme Court nominees you put on the bench, the opinion on the bench keeps on sliding to the left. independent of reality as we ordinarily understand it in, hard concrete terms, in hard scientific terms. I probably will get into global warming. That's another good example of this. So to make a long story short, and this truly is a very long story dialectically speaking, most of reactionary politics or political theory has been created as a response to these problems. It's been created as a response to the failure of what we ordinarily conceive of as liberal or democratic politics. And as such, people have been going back and experimenting with new ideas. And Mollbug is famous. Mollbug, being the most prominent neo-reactionary thinker, I think he's more famous for characterizing the nature of this game. And by doing so, he was obviously drawing on older thinkers like Gramsci, like Pareto, like Burnham. I think this is oftentimes a detraction of Curtis Yarvin that it's an accusation that he's not guilty of. He's accused of portraying these ideas as if they were his ideas. If you actually read his stuff in his blog, he's very, very good at citing sources, at least where he got these ideas. Now, were these the original sources? If he cites Burnham and the idea came from Gramsci, is that a big problem? I don't know, because Gramsci was obviously influenced by Pareto. So who knows? We could do the originalism on these things, but the important thing is that we are coming to an understanding that politics, as we've been taught it, doesn't actually work that way. And as such, we need some alternative way of playing political games. And this is where, oftentimes the big criticisms come in, very rightfully so. Because Curtis Yarvin's idea, or not his one idea, but his many ideas about the positive things we can do, are, I think, non-controversially, they're the most criticized portion of his philosophy. And this is not just true for Yarvin. I should even stop saying Yarvin, because these ideas aren't specific to him. He didn't invent them in their original form, and he's not the only person talking about them. But I should say that in all of our efforts, the ideas on what to do positively are usually the weakest. And they usually break along a few different forms. First of all, there are ideas on how to actually run things and hypotheticals. And usually when this comes to blogging platforms, this comes in the hypothetical. Imagine you had all of the power. What would you do? And Yarvin and I think a few other reactionary bloggers are quite fond of imagining a few scenarios. The most common one being, I can be CEO of America in the same way that Steve Jobs was CEO of Apple, in the same way that Jeff Bezos is CEO of Amazon. E.g., I get to have 100% of the power and I get to manage things the way I want. And for this reason, you get ideas like neo-cameralism or thought experiments that involve the transfer of 100% of political power to one receiver. And this kind of enters into a little bit of a LARP territory, and I think that's well taken. But it's an important thought experiment to engage in. And it's something that I think oftentimes critics don't give credit for the fact that this is a thought experiment. They also don't give proper understanding to what people are talking about when we're talking about the end of liberal politics. And to kind of temper this a little bit, one of the suggestions that most reactionaries have that obviously is not a thought experiment, and it obviously is meant to be enacted inside your own life, is this concept of pacifism, is the concept of internal exile, is the concept that you should not participate in Republican politics. And this is something that I take very much to heart in my own life. I make a point of not voting. It doesn't help. I mean, it doesn't hurt, I should say, that I live in a state where voting is practically meaningless. I even made a video, and I call this the video that I most regret making, but nonetheless, I more or less stand behind the thoughts that I had when I was making it. And that video is called Why I Don't Vote, with the walleye in parentheses. And I stand by this. I think, participating in oppositional politics, given what we know about how the game works, is less than useful, especially when you're on the right. But that being said, let me try to summarize the objections. So again, these objections, and I have to say, these objections were spoken on a live stream from Academic Agent's channel, and unfortunately, this was not a cigar stream. This was a unpopular opinion stream, which meant that Academic Agent had 7 guests on, and only 3 of them actually wanted to talk about interesting things, and the rest of them wanted to talk about their favorite hamburger recipes. So Emily was invited on to list her objections to the NRX pacifist perspective on politics, and I'm going to here try to steelman as much as possible her objections, and then try to address them as best I can in the time I have, and then of course go on to super chats and the like. Unfortunately, she was kind of cut off, and both me and the people who were brought on, I think Charlemagne was on the stream along with Turnip, we could only paraphrase what the objection might have been. I'm sure Emily Nephilim would have had more objections and probably could put them better than I am right now. But of course, her objections largely focus on NRX's attack on liberalism, qua-liberalism, and the NRX view of pacifism, or non-participation in mainstream politics. So her objections largely break down to, and I'm going to enumerate them here, NRX is essentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We can't get rid of liberalism and democracy. Those are good things, right? We all like having a say in politics, if it did work, like 9th and 10th grade civics class. And furthermore, we like having say. We like having our say. We like not being arrested for our political opinions. And that's great. And this is, people fault me for this a lot. I say that I like liberalism. And I'm a critic of liberalism as a theory of how humans work, but I like living in liberal society where I can not get thrown in jail for being a dissident. That's very, very nice. And a lot of people criticize me for this. That they look at my old videos and they see me saying things like, I'm a committed liberal, or I really like liberalism. And they go, oh, wow, you really changed your opinions. And to an extent, I did, in the fact that I would never say something like that currently, because I believe it emphasizes the wrong thing. But liberalism as an ideal, I kind of like. It's just a really, really bad model for how politics works. And so there's sort of this is-ought distinction. But Emily was right to say democracy and liberalism are kind of good ideals. And what we're doing is we're throwing out an ideal, and we're putting in its place a political idea of something like neocameralism, or this corporate idea, or giving all the power to these corporate masters, which is Mencius Moldbug's and I think Spandrel's go-to hypothetical. Their go-to hypothetical is always, and Nick Land also, their go-to hypothetical is always, well, what if we just had a king? What would the king do? I think that possibly misunderstands it, but well taken, right? And Emily Nephilim was very good to point out that this whole neocameralist idea of creating a monarchy, it's not so dissimilar from center-left neoliberal ideas of the Great Reset. So for people who've been kind of going around in NRX circles very recently, people have been digging up, and this is an older idea. I forget what who the person was who pioneered this, but back in the heyday of the TED Talk, when people were meeting in Davos and in Monterey and Silicon Valley and talking about their optimistic visions of the future, the idea of the Great Reset was very popular, and it's still been talked about inside neoliberal circles. And so these are the people who largely comprise the global elites, the people who manage what we call the cathedral, the big opinion makers who establish what's the right idea to have and what's the wrong idea. And if you're a dissident writer, they largely represent people with diametrically opposed values to yours. And their concept that was very popular among them, at least a few years ago, was this idea of the Great Reset. So their idea is that we're going to essentially reset the norms on all societies. We're going to have a year zero, and we're going to be able to redesign society from the ground up, exactly how the technocratic bugmen would like it. And this is going to help us not only solve the problems of global inequality, it's also going to allow us to solve problems like global warming. It's going to allow us to solve the climate crisis and all this stuff. And of course, these people who talk about the Great Reset, their vision of what humanity's potential is really constrained. It's the Davos man. It's Homo economicus. Everything that the post-Great Reset man could want could be delivered to him through an injection of dopamine and ingested through a straw or through a USB feed hooked up to the back of his brain. This is their understanding of what makes a good life is entirely in terms of pleasure and pain and stimulation, and it's utterly horrifying. And of course, people like myself and people like Mencius Moldbug and people like Spandrel and people like Endeavor and maybe Nick Land, although he's kind of one of those cases where it's hard to tell, right? We're utterly horrified by this. When we say that the health of the people is the supreme law, or when people say that, and when they imagine some kind of neo-cameralism to ensure humanity survives, we don't mean Bugman humanity. We don't mean humanity as consumer humanity, the way that the people who talk about the Great Reset do. But Emily Nephilim, she was right to say, well, I mean, you're talking about using the same tools that our enemies are. So is this not kind of like the ring of power? Are you not going to the same place that the people from Davos and Monterey, the people who give TED Talks, want to go? And she added onto that two other conjectures. And this is me piecing together a live stream talk, and I really hope I'm doing a good job with this. Emily said, well, we need to have democratic counteractivism. We need to have democratic opposition to progressivism, even to try to effect a separation or a parallelism. That's sort of the practical recommendation that people on the neo-reactionary side have. We need to have that weapon with us. And furthermore, we have a responsibility to make sure that whatever is good in society isn't destroyed by the center-left, isn't destroyed either by the communists, who have ideas that will never work, or by the Davos set, who want to essentially put us all in cubes and feed us and feed us insect hamburgers with an extra shot of serotonin or dopamine just to take the edge off a little bit. And so there's sort of a Kantian dimension to this. I'm going to use Kantian throughout this talk, and obviously. So Kant, when people say something is Kantian, what they mean is that it crudely follows what Kant would describe as a categorical imperative. And this is a very crude reading of Kant, and philosophy students will definitely say that this is incorrect. But this is the pop version of Kant, and certainly when someone says Kant in a casual conversation, what they mean is the categorical imperative, the crude version of the categorical imperative, which is to say, an action is right if you can imagine everyone doing that action and having it make the world a better place. So the classic Kantian idea of this is lying, right? So lying is wrong because, again, I know this is a crude dust jacket version of this complex idea, but we're dealing in pop philosophy here, so we have to address. I'm using in this talk crudely. So lying is bad because if everyone lied, society would completely fall apart. Therefore, lying is Kantian. Therefore, it's only ethical to tell the truth. Now, this obviously came in first from some criticism. There's this classic, and again, criticism of the crude Kantian idea, which is that, oh, well, if an axe murderer showed up to your door and he was looking for someone to rape and murder, would you tell him honestly where would you lie to him about where your wife was hiding? And obviously the answer has to be no, but doesn't that violate the categorical imperative? So you get this idea that the categorical imperative has some problems. And generally, this is what we would call the beginning of deontological ethics or non-consequentialist ethics. And the left criticism, or the kind of the criticism of consequentialism, is that, well, ultimately what determines how Kantianism is used is what the consequences ultimately are, right? You don't tell the axe murderer where your wife is hiding because there are bad consequences. At risk of taking another digression, there are huge problems with consequentialist ethics. And this is something that, you know, people from a more traditionalist point of view, people from a right-wing point of view, are very fast to point out. And the problems with consequentialist ethics are that it's consequentialist ethics want us to conceptualize ethics as if we were Olympian gods and we could predict the consequences of all our actions. In reality, we don't work that way. In reality, we have to have an understanding of what's generally a good action and judge ourselves for that. We can't constantly be hypothesizing about how we are the ultimate, well, in this case, murder and lying is fine because we can come up with a story or a narrative about how ultimately this action of lying and stealing will cause the utopia to come about. This is something that's kind of explored by people like Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment. And this is dealt with extensively in late 19th and early 20th century philosophy, if you want to get down to the weeds. But suffice to say, for this talk, there is a question put before reactionaries that are we not doing something unethical in a Kantian sense by understanding cynically the flaws of liberalism and then going against liberalism? Okay, so first I would like to say that these objections are very good. People who are on the distant right need to engage with these objections in a serious way. But I think as we see this, and I think we're going to have to start from reverse order, we have a few problems with this, right? And this is explicitly addressed in the Gray Mirror essays that Curtis Yarvin wrote, but I'm going to give my own version of it here. This is, and in a few weeks ago, I did a very popular live stream, a very popular Diss Dance. I think it was Diss Dance 33, where I was saying to everyone, look, I really, really, really want to get out of this loop that we're in. And I went over 3 loops that were kind of perpetuating themselves. There was the red state loop, which is always pretending like you have more power than you actually do. And then there is the left wing loop, which is let's pretend like we don't have a lot of power, and let's also pretend like our manifest inability to understand reality isn't going to result in bad power, isn't going to result in bad policy. That's sort of the shoe on head loop, right? Okay, well, I hate wokeness, but let's pretend that if we handed over our healthcare system to the wokies, they're not going to ruin it. Or if we hand over perhaps more pertinently, let's say that allow woke people to completely redesign the criminal justice system, and that's going to result in better outcomes. Even though the people who want to redesign it can't even mentally conceptualize this idea that policing should be proportionate to the violent crime committed. They can't conceptualize that, but if we give them the power to redesign our criminal justice system, it'll work. And so that's another cliche to loop. And so the third one was sort of the moderate loop. And the moderate loop, and this is me, I know this is not in bad faith, but I saw hints of this in Emily Nephilim's objection. The moderate loop is almost always directed at the right-winger, and it always goes something like this. It always goes something like, I see your problems with the present system, I see the insanity of the left, I see the fact that our ordinary institutions that correct wrong ideas are not correcting wrong ideas, and they're not allowing those corrections to come into play at a high level in a place of power where the issues could be corrected. Issues with education or crime enforcement or healthcare would be great examples of this. So they see all the problems. Oh, but come on, Dave. Come on. If you point this out, then no one will believe in liberalism and democracy, and we're going to have Adolf Hitler or Nazism. We're going to have a complete societal collapse. And so what kind of comes out of many of these moderate positions is this. In this, I'm thinking very much of people like Faraday Speaks while we were still on speaking terms, right? But just your general liberal moderate, circa 2017, would act like liberalism doesn't work But for some reason, me noticing liberalism isn't working is making it not work less. And if all of the bad right-wingers would stop pointing out how the system is broken, the system would stop being broken. It would be like in Looney Tunes, where if you run off a cliff and you don't notice you've run off a cliff, you don't fall, and you only fall when you notice it, right? And then gravity only comes into effect when it psychologically takes place in your brain. I guess that's slightly more plausible for politics than it is for forces incident on bodies, but it's the same idea. The issue is, is in no ways is that true. Even if liberalism were some kind of noble lie that needed to be maintained, the people who are detracting from liberalism in the main at this stage are not reactionaries. They're the radical leftists who, I don't know if the moderates have noticed this, have totally taken over both the universities and our media systems. And they're not liberals, and they don't believe in liberal principles. So it's not like we can even not talk. I mean, plausibly, before 2008, we could not talk about what doesn't make liberalism work and have this noble lie work. This idea that there is this open market of ideas. This would work if no one pointed out the facts all the way it didn't work. But now the left is undermining this faster than reactionaries ever could, and they're coming from places like the New York Times and Harvard. So nothing we are going to do is going to arrest this process. We're currently entering into a new generation of thinkers that largely don't believe that freedom of speech is a very valuable thing at all. You can look at the demographics. The recent college graduates' opinion over the First Amendment and freedom of speech has been precipitously declining. And that's not the right wing's fault. But even if it was, politics to a certain extent is psychological, and for that reason, noble lies kind of work sometimes. But to a certain degree, politics has a very real dimension to it as well. And even if liberals weren't deconstructing, even if, I should say, leftists weren't constructing liberalism from the interior of liberal institutions, no less, the reality of these contradictions would come about eventually, at some stage. And at that stage, people who cared about the fate of our civilization would have to address them eventually. So in Emily Nephilim's objections, the chief problem is sort of an is-ought distinction. We see that democracies and liberal societies have this failure mode that no one has found a way to prevent. And that's this failure mode where it keeps on tracking to the left and to the left and to the left until eventually it digests ideas that are left-wing and totally insane. And the mainstream position becomes a complete denial of reality to the extent where people who are conservatives and want to defend the status quo are defending leftist hogwash as they defend the civilization, the status quo, as they defend the civilization that they think the status quo is going to uphold. That failure mode is not addressed, and I think Charlemagne or Turnip brought this up to Emily in her live stream chat. We don't really have a solution for it. So there's this problem in these objections where we're not really taking stock of the issues with democracy. Democracy has a fault in it. It has a bug in it. Every time we run democracy, it turns into progressivism. Every time we run progressivism, it turns into communism. And every time we try communism, either on a micro scale or a macro scale, it fails. And, okay, this isn't some big thing. This isn't me bashing the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union is an example of this. Just this last week, for instance, in my home state, in the area I live in, Northern California, one of our prime institutions, Lowell School, which is kind of the West Coast equivalent of Eton. It's where all the rich people from the Bay Area send their super educated kids to get finished for admission to Stanford, or if they want to go to the East Coast, Harvard. And recently they've in the 90s they went from being kind of a more legacy thing to being purely based on grades and admission tests. It was very, very, very hard to get into the school. And just this week, they decided to go from a test and grade-based system to a lottery system. And I know what you're thinking by lottery. You think, okay, distributors, you mean that they're going to do the lottery for like a set number of slots. No, I don't mean that. I mean, they're doing it for all of the slots. So the people that this highly prestigious, highly accelerated academy is going to take on are going to be a complete cross-section of the terrible, failing San Francisco elementary school system. I consider that to be an instance of communism, and nobody who is sane thinks that's going to work. And I'm not going to say that Lowell's necessarily going to go under, right? But there's two things that are going to happen. They're either going to do this fairly, in which case the school system is going to fail, because we've known for a very, very long time that academic outputs largely correlate with academic inputs. This is one of the reasons why we can't get affirmative action does not actually cause African American achievement to go up, even when you apply that affirmative action at all levels for 50 years. It's because performance at an elementary school level depends on the family, and performance at a high school level depends on the elementary school, and performance at the college depends on the high school. It's highly, highly correlated. Outputs correlate with inputs. And so they're either going to fail because the inputs are bad, or they're more likely just going to lie. And that's also a failure. So there's two ways that communism has of working: lying and failure. The problem is, like I said, is that democracy always turns into progressivism. Liberalism always turns into progressivism. Progressivism always turns into communism, and communism always turns into either lies or outright failure. That's our failure mode, and you know, and as much as I like the idea of democracy, if we were implementing it in like a Christian monastery, as much as I like the idea of liberals, I enjoy liberalism. I enjoy walking into a room and having free discourse. That's something I like. But liberalism does not maintain liberalism. That's the issue, and that's the problem we're pointing out. Democracy does not maintain democracy. Once democracy turns into communism and communism turns into lies, you have a democracy that's run on lies and has to be run on successively more lies every second that communist system goes on, because manifestly, physically, we are not equal. And so the more we try to maintain the illusion of egalitarianism, the more lies we have to actually build our society on, and the less democracy even makes sense. And so this dissent, and of course every person who's not a reactionary has some theory about how they're going to stop this process, or they're going to arrest it. I'm not saying there isn't a way to arrest it, but we haven't found out a way to arrest it. And furthermore, our society as it exists right now is barreling down this line of causality. It's not like I can even count on it to go slowly. I can't be like, oh, I'm going to die fat and happy. You know, sure, my grandchildren might have to deal with communism, but I'll be fine. No, this stuff is happening now, and we can't ignore it. It's not even an academic concern anymore. This is a concern of real politics. Okay, fair enough. And now this more or less addresses why we can't just go with the flow and hope that this preserves liberalism and democracy. And as such, true to people who are more abstract thinkers like Nick Land and Yarvin, they come up with crackpot ideas like corporatism that sound a lot like the despotism that our elite globalist liberal class are just dreaming of and salivating over right now. But I think the devil is, the devil's not in the details, but the distinction is in what we ultimately want, right? We understand democracy is failing. This isn't a proscriptive observation. This isn't a discussion of ideals. This isn't, I didn't kill democracy. It didn't die because I wanted it to die. Liberalism didn't die because I wanted it to die. It died because it has this failure mode. The reason why the people in Davos are counting on democracy failing is that they probably realize the same failure mode that we realize right now. This is like that movie Margin Call. Everyone realizes that the market's failing. They can't do anything about it, but we all know that at some point people are going to realize it's failing too, and they're going to adjust their models the same way we are. So these thought experiments that I think highly triggered Emily Nephilim, they're thought experiments. but B, they are a very realistic and necessary thought experiment that the right is going to need to actually engage in, or in order to address the reality that democracy and liberalism have this very, very well established and seemingly inevitable failure mode that no one has been able to figure out how to stop. Okay, so I think that addresses the first four criticisms that Emily Nephilim had. This is, we are not destroying liberalism. We are reacting to the inevitable death of liberalism that everyone can see. We're not falling because we noticed we walked off a cliff. We walked off a cliff, and now we're trying to figure out about what to do about the falling problem. All right. There's one thing I haven't addressed, and that is the fifth objection, and probably naturally what Emily Nephilim would come back with is, oh, well, you should be conservative. You should be like William F. Buckley, standing athwart the history, standing athwart the train tracks of history, yelling, "Stop!" And I don't want to downplay this at all. Especially when we look at this through a Kantian lens, it almost looks not only like it not only looks like an ethical thing to do, right? Because obviously if everyone got off the train and yelled stop, the train would stop, because the train needs to have people on it to keep it going, right? So by the Kantian categorical imperative, since it's universalizable, since if everyone did it, it would be good, that is an ethical thing to do. But if you kind of believed the political bullshit that came out of National Review and more thoughtful people like William F. Buckley, and to a lesser extent people like Russell Kirk, you might believe that slowing the train down, slowing down the failure mode by which democracy and liberalism become progressivism, and progressivism becomes communism, and communism becomes lies. Slowing down that trajectory, you might think that this is actually plausible, and that somehow, by our pure will, we can slow the train down. Now, this is the critical issue that I don't think that Emily Nephilim has taken on board. Now, to an extent, Yarvin has addressed this. Why is conservative politics, or what Yarvin calls counteractivism, bad? Well, it's bad because it ultimately doesn't address reality. It doesn't address that eventually you're going to get to the cliff, even if you slow the train down. The problem also is that in order to be Kantian, in order to be universalizable, it would have to work. And this is the thing that I think, this is the critical thing that people who defend deontology, or who defend Kantian from its philosophy 101 refutation, where you have to tell the axe murdering rapist where your wife is hiding, sort of thing. They'll defend it and say, well, in order for an action to be Kantian, it's not enough that hypothetically, if everyone did it, it would make things better. The action has to actually bring us closer to that point where we're at where the problem actually gets solved, right? So in order for recycling, in order for charity to be good, right? In order for charity to be good, it can't be sufficient that the end state of 100% of people donating to charity makes the world a better place. It also has to be true that your individual act of charity, insofar as you can see its consequences in the world, makes the world a better place. And I think that in that case, the categorical imperative works, right? Because I go work at a soup kitchen, I haven't solved poverty, right? I haven't addressed the underlying issues of homelessness in the city of Seattle or the city of San Francisco. But at the same time, the macrocosmic effects of me helping people get a meal, it makes those people's lives better in the short term. And it's Kantian, it's universalizable, right? If enough people did that, it would make our homeless problem at least easier to address. But the same isn't true for conservative activism, or counteractivism, as reactionaries call it. The problem with counteractivism is that it doesn't only not address the problem, it also kind of makes the problem worse. And this is a very critical issue. We need to get over this, and we need to address this in a big way. how has our counteractivist efforts worked? Let's start from the left and go to the right. I have three figures here on this slide, and this slide is Mitt Romney, Donald Trump, and Richard Spencer. But all three of which are counteractivists. They have this idea that somehow we can create a populist movement that will yell loudly enough so that through democratic means we can either turn the train around or stop it or something, right? It's the classic William F. Buckley mode, tried in three different ways. First figure is Mitt Romney. I'll go through this quickly. Republican politics for the past 50 years, for the past 40 years, since Reagan, have they been effective? Have they done anything other than tax cuts based on debt? We've essentially printed money and purchased tax cuts with that printed money, which for myself is not a victory. I don't care about tax cuts. I care about the long-term survivability, sustaining, the long-term sustenance, that sounds weird, the long-term survival of our civilization, which printing money to buy tax cuts does not procure. The whole idea of Republican politics was that there was this respectable middle ground for which the population would naturally embrace it. I think that this basically ended with Mitt Romney. And, it could have ended earlier than that. But the issue is, the big problems, the big issues that we have to address are all guarded by taboo. They're all guarded by the university system. And what happens is there's this negotiation of lies and truth, where we have to come up with a Republican platform that's politically correct, that doesn't piss people off, and that stays within an Overton window that's created by the university systems. And all the while, we have to maintain our respectability, and I guess secretly move things around behind the scenes so that we're going to actually address the problems that are ongoing. I mean, a classic example of this is Mitt Romney himself, who, if he didn't disprove the strategy with his failure during the 2012 presidential election, he certainly proved it subsequently by endorsing every single progressive idea that's come out. Very recently, Tucker Carlson featured him marching in a Black Lives Matter protest. Mitt Romney in a Black Lives Matter protest. Where do I begin? Mitt Romney was supposed to be the poster child of the good policy above meaningless platitudes. He sold himself in 2012 as, I'm kind of a square, but I'm going to do what's responsible. And to indicate that, he made Paul Ryan his running mate, who is sort of the fiscal responsibility guy. What's responsible about Black Lives Matter? The core of that movement is portraying a problem with police violence, which might be solvable if we portrayed it in a race-neutral way. It portrays that problem and explicitly as a problem of racism. It explicitly clouds our understanding of differential crime rates, and its proposals are essentially to defund, or to perhaps even abolish, police forces that are holding at bay violent crime that would inevitably result in more Black lives being lost. So even from the technocratic Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan kind of view, where you're going to come into power, you're going to be respectable, and then you're going to what? You're going to endorse the movement Black Lives Matter so that it can end more Black lives than it actually saves. Well, why is he doing it? It's because once you actually have committed yourself to making peace with popular lies, your opponents can put any kind of ridiculous notion inside your own mouth. And because it's mainstream, and because it's respectable, and because it's what the good people do, you do it. This is the process we've already discussed, by which, through successive victory, the left inserts into the status quo respectable hogwash that conservatives have to repeat, not because it's true, but because in order to appeal to a status quo, or a status quo image or status quo respectability, that's what they have to say, even if it isn't true. And this is the end of technocratic conservatism. It's also the end of any hope that people like Mitt Romney can actually slow things down. How do you get around to Mitt Romney? Oh, that's easy. You just use the university system to get the idea into the media, and then the media makes it a popular idea among the respectable class, and then Mitt Romney will repeat it. It doesn't matter if it results in more Black Death. It doesn't matter if it results in the destruction of your entire civilization. It doesn't matter if it dooms conservatives or reactionaries to become minorities in their own country or to be completely overpowered by the Democrats in 20 years. They'll do it because it's respectable, and that's how the game plays. That's how the game is played. I would mark that kind of politics as a fail. Okay, so let's move on to the next option, right? The next option for counteractivism is Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't care about optics. He doesn't care about respectability. He purposely antagonizes the media in order to essentially get them to be his own publicists. And it was a brilliant hack of the cathedral, so to speak. I'm going to be a little bit briefer with this. I think we see the failure mode right now is that Trump is very, very good at saying random things that flip the media narrative on its head and that turn respectability politics on its head. To the extent that if he were very, very focused and very, very concerted with his activism, he could hypothetically do something that would seriously hurt the actual apparatus of power or seriously reform it from the perspective of right-wingers. The problem is that he's not focused enough to do it. He gets into power being objectionable and by flouting respectability and saying, I don't care about respectability, I just want to win. But then when he gets into office, he doesn't get into power, he gets to the next step of the problem. The next step of the problem is the rest of the cathedral. Every institution in the apparatus of power is staffed by Democrats, and even if it's not staffed by Democrats, it's staffed by people who do not want to see the status quo upended. As such, without exacting focus by the president and support by Congress in a really ideological direction, nothing's ever going to get done. And certainly nothing important's ever going to get done. There's so many ways by which Donald Trump could have, just with anything he did, he could have completely upended how the media worked. He could have completely upended how the universities work. And it would have changed the game for the right wing, both online and in real life. He didn't do it because he didn't have the focus to do it. And he didn't have the right intellectuals telling him he could do it. And he didn't understand whether this action would have cost him more than it would have gained him in the long term. Nor does he really care about the long term necessarily, because he cares mainly about the imagistics of his own brand, which is a very, very limited time frame. And so what you essentially see in Donald Trump is simply a wrecking ball without direction. We needed a scalpel and a laser cutter, and what we got was a bull in a china shop, and it's ultimately useless. And it also does, and this is okay. Let me go on to the third one before I get onto that point. Exactly. The third one's Richard Spencer. So, okay. Well, let's see. We don't have Trump doing what we want on the right because he does not have a concerted activist force behind him. Oh, so what do we do? Well, what do we do? What if we did what the left did and just made a lowest common denominator, stupid, low IQ movement and just ran that in the stupidest possible way and tried to get as many idiots on board as possible. And then, we would have our own little 1960s radical populist movement. I'm sure no one else has tried this before. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, it almost is ridiculous. I mean, Richard Spencer is someone I've criticized nonstop on this channel. I've made it no secret that I really dislike this person, and I think he's been a huge destructive force both for the right and our society as a whole. But he, if no one else, has proven that this low IQ approach to politics, this let's have a good time by being super radical and edgy, leads absolutely nowhere. And it leads absolutely nowhere. Well, first of all, because the right has a horrible quality control problem. That's the first reason. Left-wing activism. Where does left-wing activism come from? Oh, yeah, I forgot. It comes from the universities. So by the time you put forward these pot-headed ideas about radicalism, and before you give everyone Che Guevara shirts, you're essentially giving them to a class of people that's high IQ, that's pre-selected to be responsible, and that's also pre-selected to have a lot of money. If you handed out communist flags at a homeless shelter, it would be different. If you handed out communist flags at a failing Midwestern town with a lot of people that had no education, I think things would be different. The right wing does not have any ability to filter people, so it gets the dregs of society, and they all show up, and you saw it on display at Charlottesville. A bunch of violent and destructive individuals mixed in with your activist class, and of course the media could show up and just keep its camera on the worst possible people there, and then they could round them all up and throw them in jail the second someone did something illegal or violent or deplorable, which was inevitable given the low quality of individuals you had there. This type of counteractivism, the extremism because extremism is sexy, that Richard Spencer tried, is another form of failed counteractivism. But this sort of highlights the problem that all three of these forms of counteractivism have in common. And that is they inspire more. They essentially drive the left more than they drive the right. Mitt Romney, Donald Trump, and Richard Spencer have one thing, and probably only one thing, in common. And that is their careers probably helped the left recruit more permanent people than they did on the right. Mitt Romney, with all his millions, with his cringe little suit and his Bain Capital vulture capitalism, probably sent more dollars to the coffers of the DNC than he ever spent in campaign ads against Barack Obama. Donald Trump's tenure as president of the United States has characterized the largest left-wing movement in the culture war that we have ever seen in the history of America. And he largely facilitated it because it basically encouraged a whole bunch of moderate Democrats to be swept up and carried away with this whole Black Lives Matter and Antifa radicalism. And the excuse all along was Donald Trump is in office. And that's not even to get to Richard Spencer. Richard Spencer, with his fashy haircut and his cringe 80s villain demeanor and his ability to break down and give the left exactly what it wanted at every instance, he recruited, I have no doubt that Richard Spencer recruited 10 communists for every one far-right person he ever convinced to be part of his movement or any others. Richard Spencer, and that's a lowball estimate. I wouldn't be surprised if it was 100 to 1. I talked to a lot of people on the far right. I talked to a lot of people on the far left in real life here. To a man, every single one of them knows who Richard Spencer is, and he's all an active presence in their imagination. They imagine pretty much on a daily basis that they're keeping Richard Spencer from taking over the United States of America. It's ridiculous. But his image plays a huge role in their identity as people. And so we see in all of this a huge problem, and that is that counteractivism, especially counteractivism for the right, creates more problems. It actually drives our society further to the left. And this is sort of the ultimate answer to Emily Nephilim, and this is the issue that reactionaries and the dissident right are realizing, is that if we cannot think of something that's radically different from all of the things that have been tried to this point on the right, activism on the right in a way that's highly, highly visible, only ever seems to punish us, to actually hurt our efforts. And as such, it can't be Kantian. It can't be ethical to do this. It can't be effective to do this. And coming up with, and to tell people, oh, well, you need to participate in activism on the Republican side, or they're going to take away your power. I don't think that's the right attitude to take. I think that's a very destructive attitude, in fact. If you are somebody who's in the position of wanting to do the best thing you can possibly do for the right or for our civilization or for anything you care about, and you're not a progressive, we have to figure out a mode of behaving that actually helps the right more than it helps the left destroy the right. And none of these figures I have on the display here have figured that out. And no duplicates of them or no attempts to copy what they did in a slightly different way is going to make what they did work. And to a certain extent, I want to slightly digress here. It's funny enough that there seemed to have been a very similar conversation to this one going on the left wing this week, where they kind of came to terms with the problem of mainstream activism. And I'm trying to figure out a proper way to segue. Perhaps I haven't answered Emily Nephilim's question sufficiently. Suffice to say this, it would be, I do believe that activism is needed, but it has to be a very particular kind of activism that is almost invisible. It has to be the kind of activism that the ADL does. It has to be the kind of activism that activist organizations like Amnesty International do. The activism that shows up for a particular issue, obtains a victory, and then immediately disappears. It cannot be an activism that waves a flag and that is very loud, because all forms of loud activism that the right has tried have inevitably fueled the institutions that the left has supported and have ultimately, in net, I think, been total disasters for any attempt to oppose progressivism. Let alone, far from arresting the process by which democracy and liberalism become communism and lies, they seem to have accelerated it, which is the opposite of Kantian. I want to segue here, and I promise this is related, but there was this really interesting talk. There was this really interesting talk on the left. And now I've completely blanked on the name of this announcer. She has some very, very weird name. But there was a podcast that interviewed Noam Chomsky called the Bad Faith Podcast. And this was the subject of a lot of hand-wringing on both the left-wing and moderate left-wing side, and sometimes even the radical centrist side. I think Friended and Sitch did a live stream on this topic, and it was interesting. So I'll just give you a pair of, I need to give background for this people who haven't seen this. So as everyone knows, Noam Chomsky is just the bee's knees when it comes to both the moderate left and the far left. He is a famous scientist that created a revolutionary perspective in linguistics in the 1950s. But basically, since the 1960s, he hasn't done any science as far as I can figure. He basically came up with that one linguistic idea, and since then, he's more or less been this celebrity for far leftist causes. He himself is an anarcho-communist, although he rarely talks about that. For the most part, he talks about how he does not like American foreign policy. And in particular, what he does not like is he does not like Red Empire American foreign policy. Now, of course, Blue Empire, e.g. the State Department, e.g. our interactions with communists, e.g. are allowing things like the Arab Spring to kill millions upon millions of people. He's fine with that. It's just the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the American military interventions that he has a problem with. And And as such, he's much beloved both by the far left for being an anarchist, but also for the moderate left for really sticking it to all the descendants of General MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You know, all the military types that people hated during the Red Scare. He really sticks it to them, so everyone loves him on the left, and he's more or less untouchable. Well, true to 2020, he finally did get pushed back on by the far left. He went on this bad faith podcast, and Chomsky, very predictably, despite the fact that most of his career since the 1980s, he's been shouting from the rooftops that there is no meaningful difference between the Democrats and Republicans. He's been saying they're all part of the same corporate, they're all part of the same capitalist system, they're both bad. There's no choice that we have. Well, he still believes you should vote blue no matter who. How do you reconcile that? Because it doesn't make any sense, right? In some sense, it doesn't make any sense. Despite the fact that he thinks Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton are neoliberal shills, he still wants you to vote for him, right? Come on, right? You have to take all the anarchist stuff with a grain of salt, right? And it was only a matter of time before people got kind of angry at this. And he went on this No Faith podcast, and this woman, I forget her name, someone's going to write it in the chat. I'll probably see this. I'll try to focus on the chat while I talk about this. But her and her co-host just went off on Chomsky for about an hour. And Chomsky, he said something like, you have to vote for Joe Biden because in those 10 minutes, you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. He looks like Father Death. He looks like he's going to expire at any moment. He's quite old. I think he's in his 90s. And of course, the wokies were being entirely unreasonable. They're like, they were making some ridiculous case that oh well, some black people have been killed by police, so that means we don't need to vote for Joe Biden, even if he is the lesser of two evils. They were being entirely unreasonable. They seemed like they had a hard time grasping even the concept of the lesser of two evils. Someone's saying Alexis Texas was the interviewer. I forget. But at any rate, the interviewer is being entirely unreasonable and was bringing up all these non sequiturs, trying to paint Chomsky as someone who doesn't care about the black lives because he's trying to preach the lesser of two evils. And everyone who listened to this podcast, whether they're on the right or the left, even if you hated Noam Chomsky, eventually, this was sort of universally, the emotion was, I might not like Noam Chomsky, but these horrible people are haranguing him for basically being reasonable. Dumb and Dumber would be the host. Well, I was thinking they could have called the podcast with Chomsky Dumb and Dumbledore, since Chomsky looked like Dumbledore, and the two Tweedledee and Tweedledums who were interviewing him looked like they had no understanding of how politics actually worked. But true to my defense of this thing, I actually got through this podcast, and I had some sympathy for the devil. I had some sympathy for the people who were giving Chomsky a bad time. During the interview, despite all of the non sequiturs they were bringing up, despite the fact that they were trying to guilt Noam Chomsky into saying, oh, well, maybe we should throw away our vote as a protest against the Democratic Party, Chomsky was repeating the refrain, we are going to imminently have climate catastrophe if you don't vote for Joe Biden. In those 10 minutes on November 3rd, the only question that approaches you is what can make the world better in those 3 minutes. That's only decision you have to make is what's the lesser of two evils. And a vote against Joe Biden is by the nature of our system a vote for Trump and a vote for climate catastrophe. And that's all he said. He said that again and again and again, like a broken record. And on its face, it's reasonable, right? It's on its face, it's reasonable. It might be even Kantian to vote for the lesser of two evils. And this is a problem. The problem, though, is that it essentially gives the status quo a very, very easy out. On the issue of global warming, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more later. On the issue of global warming, it is very obvious, even if you are 100% on board with the recommendations from the IPCC, and for the record, I am on board with the description of the science by the IPCC, but I don't see how that connects to the recommendations. But if you're on board with the policy recommendations of the IPCC, the main issue is that you cannot noticeably see Democratic administrations in the record of climate change or carbon increase. If you look at the amount of carbon used on a global scale from year to year, you cannot detect our agreement to stay in climate accords or to not stay in climate accords. You can't detect that. It's white noise because the amount of carbon increase from Asia dwarfs it. And if we get a new technology, if we make slightly cleaner coal plants, you'll see that in the record of carbon increase before you'll ever see the difference between Barack Obama and George W. Bush. Therefore, this whole idea that Chomsky is putting forward again and again and again and again, even though it is sound logically, and the host was totally unsound from a logical point of view, the idea that Chomsky can dangle climate catastrophe in front of the face of radicals and completely nullify their votes, their protest vote against the DNC, it tells a story about how this works. There is no imminent, without a noticeable difference in the carbon increase between Democrats and Republicans, the moral impetus to vote for Democrats to avoid climate catastrophe is meaningless. Joe Biden is not going to have a noticeable impact on the amount of carbon we emit. I guarantee it. You won't be able to notice that. It will matter more if we invent a better form of coal-fired power plants, because most of the growth comes from Asia. So if we slap on a new filter on coal-fired power plants, on all of the coal-fired power plants that Asia is building currently, we will have saved more carbon emission than Joe Biden becoming president. We can't even notice the amount of carbon that Joe Biden is saving. It's undetectably small. And that's even if you believe that's even if you endorse the recommendations, which are separate from the description of the IPCC. So this game Chomsky is playing, it's transparently bullshit. More than transparently bullshit, it demonstrates how the climate catastrophe talking point is used less as an actual concern than it is as a leash for the activist branch. I am one of the few people who does not view Chomsky as this harmless old man. I think he's cynical. I think at one point he was an idealist. But this guy lives a very, very comfortable life in the status quo. I don't think it should be I don't think that it's responsible to treat 90-year-old old men who are scientists as being the vanguard of revolutionary action. Even if it was revolutionary action I agreed with, it still would not be appropriate to do that. But Chomsky has put himself forward as the vanguard of the revolution. He has not tried to slide into the background during his retirement from science. He's done everything to make himself prominent. And what does he do from that vantage point? He essentially hands the Democratic Party a collar by which it never has to suffer consequences for screwing over its activist wing. Chomsky talks endlessly about how activism outside of elections is important. But the problem is that I'm not so sure how activism outside of elections can operate, given that the elections naturally, narratively overpower anything that's done outside of elections. Once Vote Blue No Matter Who is endorsed by all left-wing activists, the DNC knows that it can perpetually keep Bernie off of the main ticket and be assured that Vote Blue No Matter Who will help them throughout the general election to defeat the Republicans. The only other thing they have to do now is to keep the Republican Party alive. And sure enough, they might not be able to beat Bernie's climate plan, but they'll be able to beat Mitt Romney's, right? So assuredly, they'll be able to have a slightly more green environmental plan, and Vote Blue No Matter Who will be in place. And Chomsky is right. Hypothetically, if an activist movement could sustain itself long enough and it had elite figures behind it, who won presidential candidates wouldn't really matter. Oh, no, it wouldn't matter, but it wouldn't. You could actually influence things behind the scenes without that. I mean, we're beyond the 9th grade civics class view of power here, and so should the left, right? The issue, however, is that what Chomsky is obtaining in this live stream is a concession that radical politics is meaningless, and I don't think that concession is survivable for the radical left, and it certainly is not for the radical right. It's defensible. I'm going to switch back to the right wing now, and this is true with all radicals, right? If the radical left endorses Joe Biden, it might as well hang up its hat, because Joe Biden is basically going to endorse the status quo. Everyone knows that. And it's becoming increasingly hard to believe that Orange Man is secretly controlling things behind the scenes. It's increasingly hard for the left to believe that Richard Spencer is controlling everything behind the scenes. And as such, it's increasingly obvious that Joe Biden is the face of the status quo writ large. He's what keeps people like Noam Chomsky in their comfortable positions. He's what keeps people like Robin DiAngelo in her comfortable position. And as the status quo becomes more and more woke, the narrative is going to increasingly fall apart for activists. You're going to work hard for whatever your activist cause is, for communism, right? And then you're going to vote blue no matter who, because Joe Biden has a carbon plan you like. And then what you're going to get is you're going to get neoliberal globalism with anti-white racism stapled to it. And maybe if you're in a position to benefit from that, that's going to be enough. But there's a whole activist class for which that's not going to be enough, and they're going to start feeling like chumps, because they are chumps. And the vote blue no matter who, despite how logical it is, quote-unquote logical, and despite how unreasonable the people who were interviewing Chomsky were, it covers up the fact that you're participating in a system that is fundamentally has you as its victim. And this is my segue for the right, and this is sort of true more so for the right. The left at least wins the left wins gay marriage. The left wins affirmative action victories, right? So the left wins its climate change goal victories. Not really the reduction of carbon, but at least the policies that supposedly reduce carbon. But the right doesn't even win. And the same thing is true. I am not against voting for Trump. What I am against is loudly being an counter-activist for the Republican Party. Because counter-activism on the right, not only does it not win, which is something that's not true for the left, not only does it inspire more activism on the left, it inspires more energy on the left than it does on the right, so it doubly doesn't win. It actually helps your enemy to win more than it does you. So it's the second reason not to impose it. But there's two reasons that counter-activism don't work for either the left or activism on the left and counteractivism don't work for either the left or the right when it's mainstream is that it constrains your imagination for what's possible. The only way the right wing is actually going to win anything is if it can find a narrative and a way of doing politics that does not energize the left more than it energizes itself. It only will ever win if it can build outside the system we've constructed. The only way the far left is going to win is if it can destroy the if it can destroy the Democratic Party and the Republican Party simultaneously. And this proposition that Chomsky put forward in his talk or in his interview, the proposition that people like Mitt Romney and vote red no matter who, vote red, better red than dead, we'll call it. The proposition they have, it's the same proposition. It limits our imagination. It constrains us. It doesn't allow us to actually think in ways that are new. If I were to concede to Emily Nephilim that we needed the Republican Party, what I would be immediately afraid of is that I would be afraid of sort of the Steve Turley effect. I would be afraid that I would be afraid that conservatives would be lured into complacency. They'd be lured into believing that, I think as we have been lured into believing, not really in my state, but in many red states, that somehow we were all part of a plan to restore things to the way they were. And in that environment, complacency is the real enemy. The status quo is the real enemy. Activism is good if we can do it and then melt away into the background. If we can accomplish our bid for power and then immediately neither fall into complacency nor be an inspiration for our enemies to fight back against us. This is not something that I see from modern Republican activism. I see the exact opposite. I see it inspiring two things. I see it inspiring activism on the part of the left, and I see it inspiring complacency on the part of the right. I see it generating a million Steve Turleys, which all they do is buy books about how they're in the middle of a conservative revolution, and then they go back to their lives. And I don't think that we can go back to our lives as they were before 2012. I think there's been a fundamental shift. I think Chomsky is invested in keeping things as they are in the status quo. There's not going to be radical change while the Democratic Party and the Republican Party exist in their present form. That's the reality of it, even if there is this climate catastrophe on the horizon. And like I said, I have never seen evidence that Democratic administrations noticeably and measurably decrease the amount of carbon that's produced in any significant way over their administrations. So it's a ridiculous proposition. On the right, and this is something that I really took from the Franklin. And oh my God, I'm so far into my time. I really apologize for this, but he mentioned something in one of his early videos. And I don't know if the video is necessarily as impactful as the phrase that came out of the video. But the phrase that came out of the video was, "This is just the progressivism we have to have." I really hate this, and I don't want to sound like I'm immanentizing the eschaton. I've been a huge opponent of accelerationism of all forms. But there is a certain amount of decline or degeneration that we have to have at this stage. Our big hurdle as members of the dissident right is complacency above all else. And we can only tolerate activism if the activism does not inspire complacency while the activism is going on. And I'm afraid that no activism I've seen has not either inspired complacency on the right or has inspired twice as much. I think probably Richard Spencer did not inspire complacency, but he was an idiot who inspired more activism to destroy genuinely right-wing causes than he ever actually enhanced right-wing causes to begin with. And for this reason, his efforts, his objectives were questionable to begin with because they were based on race, which I consider to be not very right-wing. but his methods were terrible and stupid because of that. So that's really my answer to Emily Nephilim's conjecture or her problems. Do I have time for this? Oh, okay, I'll go through this. I was going to talk a little bit about this, and I know that I'm really far behind on my super chats, and this usually means my voice is kind of going too. And this is a little bit poorly positioned here. Let me resize this. Roughly about the same time that this was going on, my friend the Franklin was making a series of videos that I wanted to address. And they largely dealt with the same issues. So perhaps the Franklin will forgive me for going through these points a little bit more quickly than I would beforehand. But he produced 2 videos. I don't know what the videos were actually called. I think they were called Parallelism or Parasitism and Pacifism. They dealt largely with how we can maintain separation from the current political order. So I suppose now that we've bid goodbye to counter-activism and loud activism of the sort of Emily Nephilim sort or the Republican sort, the natural next question is, well, what can we do? And this sort of gets us into the realm of what Mencius Mollberg says is pacifism. Detachment. Here, I think we start with Franklin's first observation, that the first thing we need to do in pacifism, before it becomes truly effective, is to realize that we're not responsible, and I have a misspelling there. We are not responsible. Let me fix that. We're not responsible for being altruistic actors in a pathological society. Now, there needs to be a huge caveat here. We are absolutely responsible for being altruistic actors for the good of humanity. We are absolutely responsible for being altruistic actors to our families and to our faiths. But we are not responsible for being altruistic actors to a society that's dedicated itself to destroying the futures of both our families and humanity in general, which I consider our society to have essentially crossed that boundary. This is something that I think perennially people like Rod Dreher and a lot of conservative Catholics who are trying this Benedict option don't realize. They don't realize that one of the key apps, God, did I say key apps? Oh my God, Silicon Valley speak has crept into my own vocabulary. One of the key features of this, and this is something that the Franklin is very, very good at pointing out, is one of the utilities of pacifism is going, I know that this action is essential to make the status quo sustainable, but I'm not really invested in making the status quo sustainable. I am invested in making my community sustainable. I'm invested in making humanity sustainable. So, public-minded individual, if you want to convince me to participate in your altruism, you're going to have to demonstrate how this altruism is altruistic in the broader sense. In that sense, the Kantian nature of our actions has to be contextualized with the fact that our society itself is not helping the cause of civilization in a macrocosmic sense. And so there's a certain amount of detachment from its projects. That is not something, I think this is the problem with Rod Dreher, is Rod Dreher, and I know this Speaking to Faraday Speaks, they want us to build communities that are separatist, but at the same time endorse society. So you'll see these people like, oh, why don't you make a society of people who just do charity for the homeless? And this is something that the cathedral is very, very comfortable with, because they want Christians and they want people who are parallelists to be altruistic, which I'm all for, and do charity, again, which I'm all for. But at the same time, they want that charity to endorse the status quo and to essentially take responsibility for the status quo's mistakes. No. I'll do charity. I'll help the homeless problem. But every second that I help the homeless, I am going to implicitly indict the society that created this homelessness problem and indict the macrocosmic and cultural policies it promotes that creates the problem that I'm fixing. Christians are not going to take responsibility for poverty. We'll try to fix it, but we'll never take responsibility for it in the way that I think many progressives want Christians to do. I mean, this is what progressives imagine. They imagine this. They're like, oh, well, Christians, how about you help the poor? Therefore, when you point out the fact that we're destroying the families, we'll be like, oh, hey, Christians, how is it going taking care of that poverty problem? Oh, wow, I guess you haven't fixed the poverty problem. I guess you haven't fixed the homeless problem. That means you must not be really serious about abortion or the family. They want us to take responsibility without having power. They want us to do charity, and they want that charity to essentially be in place of our moral indictment of their society. And this is the critical thing to pacifism. This is what makes pacifism not an endorsement of the status quo. Because I say, do charity. But every time you do charity, this charity is not an endorsement of the status quo. This charity is a fuck you, and pardon my French, to the system that creates this homeless problem and that refuses to take measures to actually address it. And I think that this is the fundamental psychological mode that any pacifist effort has to contain. I think this is something that the Franklin is very aware of, that people like Rod Dreher is not very aware of, and that I think will ultimately capsize his efforts to run the Benedict option. He never makes a hard break with the status quo. He never takes an aggressive stance. And the core thing about pacifism is that you're passive politically, but you have an aggressive mindset. You do not accept the moral framework or the morality of the outside society, and you vehemently do not accept it. However, that being said, in his last few videos, the Franklin has been quite lucid, and I've talked about this in many of my live streams. He's been quite lucid about a number of the problems that pacifism has. The main problem of pacifism, and I've experienced this, is that even with this attitude of hostility, of breaking with the status quo, it's not that simple. Because we have to deal with a society that's collapsing around us. There's a problem in two ways. The first problem is that it's harder to meet people, and it's harder to meet kindred spirits because society's collapsing around us. I live in a heavily blue area. I was going to use this year to make more connections who are dissatisfied with how things are going and actually take a pulse. Oops, I can't do any of that because we're locked down for all of this year. And even if we weren't, societal degeneration is fast at work. We can't beat that. We have to deal with the fact that the public sphere is collapsing around us as we try to use the public sphere to build our lifeboats. So there's that one problem. The second problem is that pacifism is not done in a neutral frame. As I said previously, the cathedral is not uninterested in me. The cathedral is not like, oh, hey, Dave is not acting politically against us. I guess we should just leave him alone. That's something in Brezhnevian society. Brezhnev was a later Soviet premier. In Brezhnevian Soviet society, if you didn't F with the system wouldn't F with you. And you could live in internal exile as long as you shut up. But the problem with rapidly metastasizing systems like our own is that increasingly what the mainstream cultural institutions want is this is the marker of a declining institution. They don't just want you to shut up. They want you to love them. They want you to tell them that you believe in them. They want to tell you, they want me to say, I'm an anti-racist. Oh my God. I mean, again, I don't care about race, but that's not good enough anymore, because not caring about race isn't good enough. They want me to tell them that, like, they're 100% on board with their project. As a matter of fact, part of my job, like I do a job review, I have to write a diversity statement telling everyone how I want to increase diversity at my workplace. I don't know how it would impact that. I don't control hiring decisions, but no, that's part of the job, right? That's part of the job, is writing this essay. That's part of applying for new jobs, is writing this essay, is ideological statements about diversity. They want you to love them. And loving them is the one thing that pacifism prohibits. And so we're in this situation where we have to lie, and this is difficult. This means that we have to come to some kind of this is really the dilemma we're in, but I'll just leave it here for now. That pacifism naturally has this dilemma where we have to interact with society, and every time we interact with society, we have to lie on pain of punishment. So there is this implicit directive in pacifism that we have to make a harder break with the institutions that comprise modernity. And I think the Franklin has taken more steps to that, certainly, than I have. So the Franklin, in his 2 essays, had this modification of pacifism, which he called parasitism. And this is something that he's attempted to, oops, sorry for bumping the camera. He's attempted to sort of formalize this as a kind of jujitsu against the system. Like, try to suck out the marrow of the system that you occupy. Now, again, parasitism, I don't like the word, because it smacks of accelerationism. It smacks of immanentizing the eschaton. But I see what he's saying. What he's saying is, we need to we either need to lie or not participate in the institutions. But when we don't participate in the institutions, we have to make this break aggressive, right? We can't just fade away into the background. We have to make the break aggressive, and we have to make sure that the new institutions are also situated in a way that they build power while simultaneously draining the cathedral's power. And only this will ultimately work. And actually, really like this. It's the beginning of an idea, and I'll here walk through the what he approaches in his specifics. In the specifics of his video, and he certainly wanted to make this parasitism idea the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one, and this is only my initial takes. He really harped he really only painted a very small corner of this idea of parasitism, and this was to specifically use the wastefulness of our society against itself. This is what Christians oftentimes call the sin makes you stupid strategy. So this is the idea that in our society that's as decadent as ours, the decadent essentially need to say that the weak are strong and the strong are weak. Up is down and down is up. Communism becomes lies, and lies naturally throws into the ashes things that are genuinely useful. And in the Franklin's case, he gave an example of the fact that currently in used book markets are all sorts of useful books, of beautiful books that are out of publication, that are being sold for mere pittance, that will never be published again and might even in the future be banned. This is an opportunity for us to collect these books and to make them a part of our conversation, either online or in real life. And because of this, we will have actually obtained something that has value, because the ideas of the cathedral are lies. They've made that final transition from being half-truth to being lies. And so the decision of anyone who wants to participate in a conversation will be being between what's true and what's false, what's beautiful and what's ugly. when you see something like classical music being called racist, as it was in the last month, what you should see there is not simply beauty being destroyed, but a capital resource that's unguarded and that's ready to be commandeered. Now, I don't think the Franklin explicitly said this, but what I mean, he alluded to this, and this is a core thing of his parasitism, is this idea that we need to learn the difference between investment and consumption. And, you know, I couldn't help but write in my notes CMC versus MCM. So if you're ever in a discussion with a pretentious Marxist who demands that you read Capital or Das Kapital, one of the few things that they actually extract as a learning from Das Kapital is the CMC MCM distinction, which is idiotic because Marx didn't actually invent this. So Marx, in his general formula of capital says that people who the non-capital cycle is commodity, money, commodity. So a farmer produces a commodity, which is his labor. He trades it for money, and then he trades that for a consumable commodity, which he uses to survive, and therefore produce more labor. But that essentially bleeds capital, whereas the capitalist cycle is MCM. That means you go money, commodity, money, and the money is used to buy commodities, and then that's used to purchase more money. Now, Marcus will even quiz you on this formula because it's sort of this is the highlight of Das Kapital for Volume 1. It's idiotic. I mean, Marx puts it in a framework of labor theory of value and uses it to derive new concepts. But as it exists in just this basic form, Marx he's just pointing out the difference between investment and consumption, which was an idea that existed well before Marx. You can see it in Adam Smith. You can see it in older economics. You can see it in mercantilist ideas of economics. It's really, really stupid that this was his idea. But I couldn't help but point out here that this is the idiotic idea that he was kind of cribbing. But this is important in all endeavors of power, is to understand the difference between investment and capital. And the issue with a lot of us is that a lot of our money gets bled out, or not investment and capital, the difference between consumption and investment. The problem with a lot of people is that we bleed a lot of our money into consumption. I am one to speak. I bleed a lot of money into consumption. Now, most of that money is consumption of food, which and toys and products for the baby, which I don't really think is consumption in the sense that the Franklin means it, but it's not going to appreciate in value. But we need to make, as a political portion of our platform, how do we continuously build more investment in our political communities? How do we invest more and how do we consume less? How do we make sure that we buy from people who are inside our political community? And how do we make sure that we buy minimally outside our political community? And this is a very, very core lesson that we can take, I think, we should take this to the bank. Is it sufficient? No, it's not sufficient. It would be really, really good if we could do this. If we could, but it's not going to create the kind of radically separate communities we need in and of itself. And this is something I just want to talk about briefly. I made this slide, and it's my last slide. So inside parallelism or parasitism, when these two concepts were discussed and distinguished from each other, I couldn't help but think of the two groups that Curtis Yarvin has identified as the two most successful parallelist groups or pacifist groups in America currently, and certainly the two most successful groups that I would consider in America today. And those are the Orthodox Jews that live in New York and the Amish that live in Pennsylvania. The Anabaptist groups that have been surviving and thriving with high birth rates for a very, very long time. Now, I have different opinions about these groups. The problem is they're a varying difficulty to talk about. Let's start with the easy group, the Amish. Now, I'm sure the Amish think that I'm going to go to hell for being a filthy papist and being a usurer because I make income on passive investments, and for any number of reasons. Maybe I'm saved. Who knows? But as a Christian, nobody, and I challenge anyone really to do this, I don't think there's a Christian alive who doesn't look at the Pennsylvania Amish and go, oh, it's so... There's just this nice little warm feeling that wells up in your soul every time you see them, because deep down, you kind of want to live like them more than you want to live like... In some ways, you find their lifestyle more preferable to your own, and you consider it more authentic than your own. And I love computers. I love technology. I'm an engineer. But I understand that technology has a certain poison to it, and we need to confront it. Okay, but that's not the subject we're dealing with right now. The Amish, as far as I can tell, are purely pacifist. They don't politically interact with the mainstream. They're also, for all intents and purposes, purely parallelist. They don't really drain resources out of the system, as far as I can tell. Now, I am not somebody who has hostile opinions of this other ethnic group that is pictured, this other ethnic group that would be associated with the New York Orthodox community. And for a very long time, I had a very positive view of the ultra-Orthodox in New York. However, talking to people who live near their communities for a very, very long time, I can definitely say that they're certainly in more of the Franklin perspective. They drain resources from the system. They abuse welfare. And they are absolutely political. They vote on school boards, and they vote for the absolute least amount of taxes. They totally defund public schools because they don't use them. And then they use those taxes to fund their own schools. And they're thriving. They're absolutely positively thriving. Now, hey, look, I'm actually positive on this. I hate the mainstream school system. I hate the cathedral. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't need to oppose the ultra-Orthodox community because they're just draining resources from a system I hate anyway. So, well struck. As a blow against the cathedral, the ultra-Orthodox community is, for all intents and purposes, my ally. However, I would not feel comfortable creating a community that was as deeply parasitic as the ultra-Orthodox community is in New York. I think a lot of what they do straddles the line as being not ethical for Christians. However, that's not my point. Maybe there will come a time where Christians have to do what the ultra-Orthodox do to survive. And I think that puts it in a different light. Maybe it is justifiable. And as corrupt and as decadent as our system is, I can't say I blame them. I don't. I think that that's not something that, I don't really have a problem with what they're doing, even though I would definitely say there's a lot of ethically questionable actions the ultra-Orthodox do in New York. And I think that Christians would have to look at themselves again. Christians can't have an action they consider immoral to do to Christians and then go like, oh yeah, let's make money doing that to other people. That's something that's definitely a difference between our religions. And that obviously, usury has historically been that specific action that the Christians haven't been able to do that this ultra-Orthodox community is able to do. But this is not the point I want to get to here. So here's the question, the magical question. What do these communities have in common? A, they're pacifist. Okay, so, Moldbug, aka Curtis Yarvin, very clear pointing out that. They do not participate in politics. They don't participate in macro politics. I think the Orthodox community does, but the Amish community certainly doesn't. They're parallelist, right? They have completely separate society. They are morally detached. They do not do what the cathedral wants them to do. The Amish do not go, oh yeah, your technological society, it's great, and homelessness is actually our fault. They don't do that. It's very clear if you look at how the Amish societies actually function that they have a very low opinion of modernity, which they should have a very low opinion of modernity. I have a very low opinion of modernity. As far as I'm concerned, that's to their benefit. So they do not morally cuck, to use a crude term, to the system, to our sensibilities about what Christians should and should not do. That's a commonality both between the Orthodox and the Amish. So there are those three things that are in common. Those are all very nice, and we can all do those things. There's one magical fourth thing that no one mentions, that are the commonalities between the ultra-Orthodox community and the Amish community. It's actually the most important thing about two of them. They have an implicit agreement from the people who are proximate to them culturally that they won't be destroyed. The Amish are. So where does the cathedral come from? The cathedral is Protestant Christianity that's secularized. Even progressives, when they look at the Amish, get that same kind of warm feeling in their souls because they're Christian. And as much as they think that they're backwards and stupid and behind the times, something in their soul of souls goes, oh, go, those guys aren't villains. They're just us. They're just an earlier version of us. Similarly to that, the ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York. When another very powerful group in our own society looks at them, who are approximately their co-religionists secularly, they get a similar warm and cozy feeling, and they think, oh, I just can't hate you. I think you're backwards. I think you're stupid. I think you're sexist, racist, and homophobic. But I know you're not a villain. You're not like that Richard Spencer guy. You're just a little bit behind the times. You're just so cute. You're just so cute. I can't hate you. And moreover, more than that, I won't let people be activist against you. This is something that's true. The Amish have an understanding. If you could bring anti-discrimination laws against the Amish, you could sue the Amish out of existence. If you could bring sexism suits against the Amish, I mean, obviously they have loopholes, right? But if you could imagine a law passing that would demand all organizations adhere to modern sexuality norms, which would mean that anything owned by Amish churches would be in violation, and you could sue them. And what are they going to pay you when they're not very rich, right? You could raise the property taxes on them and run them off their land. If only a few regulations were out of whack. I mean, you could call the Amish a productive... Yeah, this is how you get the Amish. You call the Amish a productive covenant, and then you sue them. It is a productive covenant. They only sell their land to other Amish people, right? It's a productive covenant. Sue them. They're dead. Well, they don't, because they're grandfathered in, because there's an understanding in our society that destroying the Amish is not good. It's yucky. It's evil. And so the primary group in our society, progressive secularized Protestants, don't go after the Amish. And the other culturally dominant group in our society, a progressive secularized non-Christian religion, has a similar warm and cozy feeling with the ultra-Orthodox communities in New York, and it doesn't go after them. There's 1,000 ways. If evangelicals did what the ultra-Orthodox did in New York, they would be sued out of existence in 2 seconds flat. More importantly, every left-wing activist would be up in arms, and they would put pictures of these horrible evangelicals on their posters, and they'd be the poster boys of weird religious bigotry in America. They'd be the poster boys of what a religious bigot looks like. He would look like an evangelical Christian from New York. Well, there aren't any evangelical Christians from New York, but you know what doesn't happen? You don't have ultra-Orthodox people with beards and broad hats and yarmulkes put on posters as the image of religious bigotry in America. You can complain about the ultra-Orthodox in New York, but you're prohibited from activism against ultra-Orthodox in New York. You cannot say that we have a blank problem in New York. You can't. I mean, actually, I think, didn't Cuomo say that? And he got in deep trouble. He said we had a blank problem in this state, which means that we need to have a blank solution in this state. Maybe a solution with some finality. Obviously, that's a problem. You cannot go after that community with activism. That's what the Amish and the ultra-Orthodox community in New York have in common. It is political poison to use them as the whipping boys for your activist community. Any further parallelist movements, in addition to what the Franklin is talking about, they have to be political in one regard. We have to make it absolute poison to use us as a motivating factor in the cathedral's counteractivism. Until we do that, until we punish that or find some way to punish that, our political projects will be retarded in a very, very discreet, very, very acute way. Subtle, but absolutely devastating. The danger with pacifism is that we're always inside this Scylla and Charybdis-like situation. We have to be passive enough to not appear on the cathedral's radar and to be used as a motivating feature for their counteractivism, but we have to be hostile enough to the cathedral not to get sucked into their siren call. We have to be hostile enough not to be co-opted by them. We either have to be experts at splitting the difference between these two things, or, very slowly over time, we have to build a very, very subtle and very, very discreet political apparatus that will punish any attempts at scapegoating or coming after or materially hurting communities that are pacifist and not interfering with macrocosmic politics, that are reactionary and traditionalist. That needs to be the centerpiece for our political efforts. And I do think there need to be some very subtle political efforts going on into the future. And with that, whoa, that's 2 hours of lecture. I'm going to have to end the lecture portion, thank God, because I am way behind on my super chats. Anyway, I hope that answered the question. And with all those digressions, I'm certainly ready for super chats. So I have both entropy and the super chats going on. So as usual, I will read the entropies first and then get to the super chats later. I think that's the best way to do things. I don't really know if these super chats, these things, does entropy do this so that the ones on top are the shoot. Okay, I'm going to do the first two from the this is the problem with having two super chat systems, is that you have two places to read questions. Okay, I'm going to go from the first two since I know that they were early. And I'm going to do those, and then I'm going to go to an entropy system. And then we'll finally circle around and see if there aren't any unique ones on the on YouTube. Okay, so the first super chat is Funny99 Man for $10. He says, the fantastic Worthy House YouTube channel has the best critique of Curtis Yarvin. He would be a very interesting person to talk with, since his own description is of the nouveau. His own description is nouveau riche and a reactionary. Well, I mean, again, these recommendations, I'm going to write this down in my notes. Worthy House, you say? I'll certainly check that out. Writing it down right now. I don't really have a lot to say about this particular super chat. Thank you very much for the $10 contribution. I hope you can forgive me for going on since I'm ahead of time, and I probably can't give you $10 worth of an answer for a reaction to a YouTube channel that I haven't watched yet, but I'll certainly keep my eyes peeled for their reaction. Paul for £20. I've recently spent some time in the Czech Republic, a sophisticated developed nation where every progressive seems hostile, where even progressives seem hostile to aspects of Western modernity. Do you ever think reactionary movements might develop abroad? Well, to a certain extent, they do develop abroad, and I think it's not only possible, I think it's essential. But the essential thing with this is that for ages, the left has been one international cause. This needs to end. There can, at least between America and Europe, there cannot be two distant right communities. There needs to be a lot of different distant right communities, but they all need to interact with each other across the pond. Now, ideally, ultimately, I'd like to draw in people who have problems with modernity, who are Muslim, who are Confucian, who are African. I think it ultimately needs to be an international pushback against communism, against progressivism. But we'll see how workable that is. At bare minimum, the left in America and the left in Europe need to work together and need to work closely together. Now, I've been to the Czech Republic many times. Both my wife and I have friends there. I can't say I know the country very, very well. Obviously, you know, it's Central Europe, and my father's family comes from Central Europe. One caveat I have to this Central European reaction that's coming out of places like Hungary and the Czech Republic, is I don't understand it very well, by my own admission. But B is I fundamentally think it must be incomplete because it's fundamentally not spiritual. It's fundamentally secular. The Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary have an issue where they're not religious, and the Czech Republic in particular is a particularly non-religious country. And as a consequence, they look very based in their temporal policies. But they don't seem to have the robust family life that I would consider to be one of the foundational elements of any lasting reactionary or dissident right movement. And so perhaps reactionaries from America could work with our Central European brothers to bring back a sense of spirituality and a sense of family values to their efforts. It's also important, and this is something, it's also important for American reactionaries not to endorse policy specifics of Hungary. Just say things like, I think what they're doing is interesting and is a good experiment. What a lot of dishonest actors like to do is they like to say, oh, so-and-so endorsed Viktor Orban. I don't endorse Viktor Orban. I don't endorse any politician. Endorsing politicians is not something I ever do. When Faraday Speaks broke with me and called me a liar, and so on and so forth, one of his mods inaccurately reported that I was a supporter of Viktor Orban. I never have ever endorsed a politician on this channel. And I recommend that if you're an intellectual or an artistic or a cultural figure, never endorse politicians. We can say that they're better than the alternative. We can say that what they're doing is interesting, but you don't study this country. For all you know, Viktor Orban might be. You don't know. He might have an affair. He might be a child molester. Who knows, right? And the last thing you want to do is to have the millstone of some politician from thousands of miles away being hung around your neck. So I would highly recommend consider right-wing activists from Central Europe and from Europe to be your compatriots, but never endorse politicians because you don't know enough to endorse politicians. Okay, so thank you very much for that $20, £20 super chat. Wow. I'm going to go to the entropy chats and hopefully privilege them. Okay, so it definitely starts from the bottom, so I should start from the bottom now. Any thoughts on John Eldridge's Wild at Heart? Like the initial premise, but my slow food book club agreed to drop it about halfway through the book. Well, I know of that book, but I haven't read it. I'm a very slow reader. I do read, but currently the books I'm reading are Boethius. I'm reading Boethius. I'm brushing up on some Hegel, which is a little bit laborious, and that's kind of it for now. Maybe I could give Wild at Heart a read, but this recommendation is maybe I'll read a summary of it. The problem is some of these summaries aren't, I don't know. They're sometimes reading summaries is a ticket to being is a ticket to being mid-wittery. I try to be at least reasonably a fay of these authors before I try to comment on them. But thank you very much for the super chat. I really appreciate the support, guys. Speaking of consumption, that's not that's not investment. The taxes on this state are insane. A fourth of my income goes to taxes. A fourth of my income. And I'm barely breaking. I like zero savings. I'm barely breaking even raising a family in this godforsaken state. This is atrocious. The taxes are out of control here. I don't know. This has really, really, really modified my designs about ultimately living here. Pragmatic Culture for $5. I haven't caught the last few streams, but glad I'm catching this one. Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that's a short question, so I can go on and answer the other ones. Thank you very, very much. Hellsberg for $5. I'm going to need to actually change my drink in a few seconds, just because I'm way over time here. So I might need to do that after this next question. But Hillsberg for $5 says, I have a family member who hates everything. Other people, including his own family. I think he just hates living. How can I help him? Well, does everyone really hate everything? I mean, what does he like doing with his time? I mean, he must like music or video games. One of my favorite bloggers I don't read her very much anymore, although I am subscribed to her on Substack. Leia Labresco. She's one of these Rod Dreher types, total optimist. I don't think she's enough of a pessimist for my taste, but she's quite bright, and she has her heart in the right place, and she's probably a better Christian than me, which I'm envious of. But she always says that the best way to engage with people is to see them as lovers of things. I don't think you can help anyone without knowing what they love first. So my recommendations on how to help your family member is to figure out what they love and then start from there. So I guess stop from the opposite place of what you know about them, what you've given them. Guys, I have to take a 5-minute break to stretch my legs and get a drink, but I'll be right back to answer the rest of the super chats. So let me mute and... Okay, so I'm back. Okay, hopefully that I'll make sure nothing. The Serb question, yes, no. That's. Do you know how epically bad? I mean, the Serbs. The Serbs are like the ancestral. I mean, I guess the Turks are more our ancestral enemies, but like the Serbs were like a close second, right? Like, never mind, never mind. I'm not going to get into Eastern European politics. I really am not. Okay. That everyone just stay out of Balkan conflicts, right? Um, so thank you, Halsberg, for your super chat. Thank you very much. Alex Ashby for $5. Thoughts on Peterson's return and how Christian he sounded in his last video at points. Well, I mean, this is the thing with Peterson is that he is Christian. He's also. I mean, Peterson. My thoughts on Peterson's return is that he's never going to be. He's obviously aged quite significantly since his. He obviously aged quite significantly since his last appearance. I don't think he's ever going to be at the intellectual height he was in 2017. Intellectuals age, and if you look at Noam Chomsky, you can see this. I mean, he looks like Father Death. He sounds like Father Death. There's just an aging process going on. My reaction to Jordan Peterson's Christianity hasn't changed. I think it's obvious that he, in his soul, I mean, emotionally, he is a Christian. Emotionally, I don't think you can stop being Christian. I think he's intellectually. I want to use the right word. Embarrassed is not the right word, and cowardly is not the right word either. I think he's been intellectually scared by modernity into not diving deeply enough into the spiritual claims that Christianity makes. But I'm looking forward to the work that he can possibly do, getting people interested in scripture again. And because of that, I think he's a positive influence. I never knew what people meant when they were talking about Jordan Peterson, being being a bad for the right. He's great for the right. He got a lot of people asking the right questions. The fact that he counter-signaled people that were racially obsessed, I think was just something that was, he had to do. I mean, I guess there is something for. I think he needed to go in a more right-wing direction, but more and more, I just look at people as being where they are, and sometimes there were a lot of people who needed a person in the place where Jordan Peterson was, and I'm not so sure his witness would have been enhanced if he had embraced the right wing more deeply. I'll say that. I look forward to his intellectual contributions. I would not expect a figure emerging in the same fiery way that Peterson emerged in 2017. Ducat for $5. The majority of the issues here can be levied against one man. Look up Edward Bernays. Well, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Ducat. That's an excellent point. Edward Bernays was the father of modern marketing, I believe. That's what he's called, right? I mean, well, yeah, this is the thing. I mean, I guess you could say, our leaders realized at some point that they could game democracy. And Edward Bernays was a huge person in this realization. They realized that they could get what they wanted. If you control the inputs of democracy, you control the outputs. But I don't know. I mean, once that knowledge is out there, I don't think you can go back. I think what we have to realize now is we have to realize that democracy in many ways is a lie. It's something that can be controlled. And as such, the main thing that us, the people, should be interested in is not that we are not ruled by elites. We will always be ruled by elites. We will always be ruled by oligarchs. The thing that's our concern is that the oligarchs have their skin in the game, and that the oligarchs truly have our best interests at heart. If you look at Israel, for instance, it looks like a reactionary paradise. Israel is methodologically one of the most successful right-wing countries in the world. The other one might be Erdogan's Turkey. Why are they succeeding at this Republican thing in a way that no country in the West is? They're succeeding because their elites have skin in the game, and they're very easy. Because they're not Christian, they can very easily separate themselves from the cathedral. They don't have those painful ties, and also they're co-religionists that are part of the cathedral. They have some strategic hypocrisy that's that helps them out a little bit in that regard. But there's a very good video that was done by Morgoth this last month. It was on the surveillance state. I congratulated on him when I saw it. So, as everyone knows, there's a 21st century surveillance state social credit system in China that's been erected, and that's very, very effective. And, it would not be an original take to compare the surveillance and social credit state that's arising in China to the woke orthodoxies that are fast taking hold of the West, both in Europe and also in America. That wouldn't be an original take. But what would be a fresh take, maybe not the first take from the right wing, but certainly I found it refreshing when Morgoth said it, is comparing the Chinese surveillance state to the Western surveillance state and realizing that in many ways the Chinese surveillance state is more based. It's better. It's more oppressive. It's more explicit, but it also encourages healthy behavior. Morgoth's example was the ideal person for the Chinese surveillance state is a new Chinese mother who completely supports Chinese nationalism, who thinks that the health of the Chinese people is the primary goal, and who wants to have a large family with lots of children, and who wants to educate those children to adhere to things like Confucianism and belief in the Chinese state. I don't like the fact, and what's the worst thing? What would be penalized? It would be like a sexual deviant who didn't want to have children and who wanted to undermine the state and who didn't want the Chinese people to have a future, or who thought that the demographic replacement of the Chinese people was a good thing. In the West, it's the exact opposite, right? In the West, it's the exact opposite. Nationalist housewives would be targeted for cancellation, and people with alternative, non-procreative lifestyles that would only be a drag on the system would actually be helped by the left-wing cancel culture. So it's the exact opposite. And so I think I don't want to have our surveillance state, but if I'm going to be ruled by oligarchs, and if I have to be ruled by people who are going to incentivize me, why isn't it governed by the health of the people? Why is it governed by people who seem to be more interested in pleasure than in the ultimate survival and humanity of the very humans that they govern? I think that at minimum, if democracy and republicanism is going to persist, salus populi supremum lex. So thank you very, very much, Duckett, and I'll just continue going on because I've got to go on if I'm going to not just keel over from exhaustion after this really, really long talk. Nerve AMV Maker for $35. Thank you. Wow. Thank you very much. Ever notice the similarities between the Benedict option and the and the Grail quest in the Arthurian cycle. The quest is spiritually fulfilling, but it removes the best knights from politics. This exit leads to the realm's destruction. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of interesting. Well, what I immediately want to say is, you know, any successful oligarchical system will have a Grail quest to make sure that young men with too much energy have their efforts put into productive means. I mean, so for instance, what if it's obvious that young men need to be employed? Young men need to have a quest to go on. Right now, that quest is communism. What if that quest was going to Mars? That would be a lot more productive. It would be a lot more plausible than getting communism to work. I mean, even in communism, it's the worst kind of communism. It's the kind of communism that's entirely uninterested in intentional communities, and it's entirely interested in seizing political power. Any stable system is going to have a Grail quest. Now, maybe the Grail quest of Arthur went too far. Maybe he made sure that all of the ethical knights were on the Grail quest, while Lancelot was absconding with Guinevere. Maybe he made all the competent knights go on the Grail quest, and no one was there to do the taxes in Camelot. Obviously, this is mythopoetic, mostly emphasis on myth. And maybe there was a historical Arthur, but it certainly didn't, whatever. But in practical politics, you want something to occupy the dreamers and have someone competently manage your state. But you also want to have ethical people have productive lives, right? You want to make sure that the yeoman farmers, they have the children that will go on to be your bureaucrats. And maybe the bureaucrats don't have children themselves, but they've got cousins and they've got nephews and nieces that continue on their society and their family. And so there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the traditional core and the religious core and those people who actually manage the society. I don't know a way for skin to be in the game without, to some degree, it being genetic. Genetic and religious skin in the game is why we don't sue the Amish out of existence. Genetic religious skin in the game is why your secular Jewish Marxist professor at NYU doesn't see the total destruction of the ultra-Orthodox community 2 blocks down to be her eminent political career in life. Whereas almost certainly every secularized Christian in the cathedral sees it their mission in life to destroy their Orthodox contemporaries. I don't know. One of the main failures in contemporary politics is that the living genetic element of our politics, e.g. the red state, has fundamentally been culturally separated from the culturally ascendant blue stater, and that they're fighting each other. It's weird. It's like a body that's attacking itself. And it's why that we're having such a difficult time. What I would say, AMV Nerve Maker, is that Grail quests can be destructive in part and can be necessary in part. And it's up to a good king to know the difference between a good Grail quest and a bad Grail quest, and then to properly calibrate those Grail quests. So thank you very much. Anarch Bombadil for $5. You mentioned a need for a new right-wing global prime directive. I did. I still stand by that. How does a Catholic square this with the Christian mission? Great content, my dude. Well, I think that when I say prime directive, I don't mean like Tokugawa level prime directive. What I mean is that spreading the word of God has to be done inside certain purviews. So, for instance, I think part of a global prime directive is to say that religious exchange can happen. For instance, we can say that rabbis and imams can't come over and they can, introduce their worldview to a certain number of elites, because we need to have elites that are aware of our worldview. And in exchange, our missionaries can go forward and try to convert or educate their elites, right? This is an exchange that I actually feel very confident that Christians can eventually win this. And I feel that this is the only ethical way of spreading Christianity. And I'll say this, what we don't allow is a demographic change to drive religious conversions. I feel very comfortable for how Christianity conquered Germany. I feel very comfortable with how Christianity conquered Armenia. I feel very not comfortable with how Christianity conquered North America. I do feel Catholicism is true, and I believe that Kukulkan worship and the Aztec religion was not only a false religion, but a massively wicked one as well. But I don't like the idea that the Aztecs were in part genetically replaced. They weren't all genetically replaced, but I feel that it would have been cleaner if it was a pure conversion. And I never really, sometimes conquest is necessary, but I think this is another very subtle question that needs to be taken on and cannot be answered in 5 minutes. But I would say that a prime directive has to be subtle, but it would contain within it certain ways by which religious conversion are kosher and not kosher, to borrow a term from another religion. And one of the non-kosher ways is to just replace the population and call it conversion. To me, replacing a population genetically and calling it conversion is not actual conversion. It's colonization. Colonization isn't conversion, right? I don't want to replace the Japanese culture. I just want to correct their theological views. So thank you very much for that super chat. The Prudentialist for $10. Hi, Dave. Do you think that there's a way to synthesize NRX pacifism and retaking institutions like normie cons want to? Why or why not? Sincerely, the guy you said shh to on Twitter. Well, okay, that shh is that's a joke from South Park, right? It's a joke where like your enemy's doing something stupid and making a fool out of himself, and someone's going like, well, should we correct him? And you go, shh, let's get him to do that stupid thing so we can benefit from it. It's a joke, so I wasn't shushing you like Dr. Evil. I know you're right, but our enemies are doing something stupid right now, and I don't want them to stop doing something stupid. So don't correct them. Okay, so the retaking institutions thing. So why is retaking institutions... So there's 3 general NRX, distant right, post-political reaction to institutional dominance of the left. Those are accelerationism, pacifism, and entryism. Now, I hate accelerationism. I'm more fond of entryism. Accelerationism always sounds like immanentizing the eschaton, which is a big no-no. But why is everyone so down on entryism? Well, entryism, people are down on it, and Moldbug dealt with this in one of his recent essays. Is progressive dominance is so overwhelming that it's very difficult to imagine how you're not going to... They're hyper aware of reactionaries. So the first thing they do is they constantly have you give loyalty oaths. And they know the kind of things that you can't say, and their goal is to make you say those things. And so since they're virtual bloodhounds for reactionaries, it's very, very hard to infiltrate. The only way you can infiltrate is to be such a good duplicate of of a progressive, that you're hired in the closet, and at the rate we're going, you might as well die in the closet because you're such a good copy of a progressive. There's this natural drift that goes on where you naturally start taking on the opinions of people who are around you. And for that reason, retaking institutions through infiltration seems very, very, very difficult. I mean, it's going to have to be both and. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, this is the thing. Obviously I have a career, right? So I'm an entryist to a certain degree, right? Like I have a career and I have a passion. So I guess, for anyone who can't completely separate themselves, entryism is going to be a thing a little bit. I just don't know. Retaking, I mean, what would the institution be that we retake? I mean, schools comes to mind, right? I mean, classical music might be an institution that we retake because I think at some point the audience for classical music will be dominated by people who understand the woke religion is bad, because the woke religion will be hostile to it. This sounds like a cop-out, but I think this will organically happen. I think what will happen will be it will be less entryism than it will be mass defection from moderates. So an institution will have a mass moderate defection, and I think the role of the reactionary is to bring into conversation the defecting moderates with the separatists, and to get them to see their struggle as one and the same. So I hope that answers the question. I know I'm going fast with these questions. I should do a distance that's just a straight up answer questions distance. None of these 2-hour lectures, because these things get packed. They're almost like videos that are just on the quick. Right flag for USD 25. Thank you very much. Regarding suspicion towards altruism, is there utility in openly assuming anti-patriotic stance? For example, shouldn't reactionaries publicly discourage their compatriots from joining the military? I think the anti-patriotism is bad. Anti-patriotism, pacifists are not traitors, and anti-patriotism cuts a little too close to treachery. We believe that the society is decadent, but we don't backstab our society. We try to separate ourselves from it. We are rebels. We are not traitors. That is incredibly an important distinction to make, because I consider treachery to be really bad. It's subtle. It's really subtle, but I don't like people who hate the country they're a part of. There's this really disgusting video that's in Britain. It's part of this Pakistani British culture. I don't know why Pakistanis are particularly bad at this, but they're this uncanny ability to insult their host culture. It's this woman talking about how she loves living in Britain, but she hates British culture. And Indian culture is superior, but she wants to live in Britain. I don't care about race, but like, isn't that a disgusting sentiment? Just period. Like let's say the shoe's on the other foot, and it was. I like Rudyard Kipling, and I understand that he had some racially insensitive attitudes about South Asians. And every now and again, you kind of catch that reading his books. And that's sort of his worst moments, right? Rudyard Kipling's best moments are when he admires the people he lives among. And his worst moments are when his contempt, he has contempt for them. And I'd like to think that Rudyard Kipling genuinely liked South Asian culture. I think there's something very, very spiritually poisonous about living among a people and living in a people's homeland and being anti-patriotic. I think it's fine saying their religion's wrong, I want to correct it. It's fine saying they're technologically backwards, I want to improve it. But if you're living in someone's homeland, and I know probably you don't mean anti-patriotism in this way, anti-patriotism, it skirts close to this spiritual treachery that I'm very not comfortable with. So I'm just going to say no to that. As for joining the military, that's a question that I don't think I can rightfully answer. I think it's just an open question between you and the specific political circumstances as you see them. That being said, I will say that no matter what, if you are a veteran of a war, you are a hero. I said this before, the people who died for every war are, in my they're participating in something that is a noble profession. We should realize that military virtues are always virtuous. I don't care if it's the British Empire or the Turks. I don't care if it's the Janissaries or the Persians. I don't care if it's the Third Reich or the Red Army of the Soviets. My family suffered under the Red Army of the Soviets. But I would never dream in 1,000 years to take down a monument dedicated to the Soviet Army, because just think how hard they fought against my own grandparents. They fought, but there was heroism in that. So I would say, I would not discourage you from joining the military. I would say just look at the benefits and the costs, but don't be an anti-patriot. Just make your feelings parallel to patriotism, if you can. Thank you. Argyle from Euphoria for $10. Tip jar. Write a book. Well, thank you very much. My distributism project is kind of taking book form. I also had a fiction book in the works somewhere in there. It's all a matter of time. Thank you very much. Thanks for that being short. I can try to get through these things. Dreadnought for $5. The Amish are just being saved for later because they are so obviously not a threat. They have no effect on the culture. They convert almost no one. Yeah. But if they're being saved for later, that implies that there's going to be very much of a later for the cathedral in its present iteration. I'm not the first to wonder if our current form of cultural elites isn't rapidly approaching their shelf life. I mean, have you seen what moderate liberal progressivism looks like? I mean, I haven't watched tonight's debate, but have you seen Joe Biden? Have you seen Joe Biden's followers? I mean, stick a fork in it. Good Lord. It's stale. It's stale. I feel sorry for the people who are moderate Democrats. And you can only make it interesting by trying to mix in communism. I mean, mixing communism into your ideology to make it seem topical is like mixing cocaine into your software, into your cooking, trying to make it seem tastier. I'm sure it works to a certain extent, but it just means that I think the Amish are going to outlast the cathedral, to answer your question. I think that the Amish are going to outlast the people that are currently defending them. So that being said, I don't know, maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe they're going to show up in 10 years. They're going to show up in 10 years claiming that the Amish are trying to reconstruct the Republic of Gilead and then accuse them of forming a protective covenant in their own land. Best ballers for $10. How would we begin to fix the problems in our universities? I mean, I don't think that you can fix the universities in time. I think your attitude towards the university should be, I want to get in, get the skills I need, and get out. That's the attitude towards the universities. Or better yet, how do I take this thing the university does and export it to an institution that I trust more? Universities are ruled by tenure and admins. The admins are trained by the cultural studies departments. They are uninfiltratable. Your job as an admin at a university is to be as progressive as possible and to be more progressive than the tenured professors. How you get to be a tenured professor at a university is to essentially have an 140 IQ, an absolute dedication to your research, and then the approval of all the other employers who work at your department, because it's very, very easy to lose tenure for any reason. That's about as uninfiltratable as an institution as you can possibly imagine. I think parallelism has got to be our approach with the universities, flat out. We've got to find a way. Parasitism might be a better way to put it. We got to find out what we need from the universities, what we can do ourselves, and what we need to piggyback on top of for the time being. But we're not going to take them back. That's almost impossible. Emmett 5 for $5. Dave, what would be a concrete example of skin in the game? What mechanisms would work to ensure that elite's interests align with ours? We have to have a common religion. This sounds like a cliche, and you're probably going to slap me for saying this. Men always have religion. This is true. Jordan Peterson's obviously a Christian. He's the brain of mainline Protestant. He's the brain that evangelical Christianity apparently lost. Basically like the Skeksis and the Uru from the Dark Crystal. The brain of mainline Protestantism and the heart in evangelicalism. But he's still Christian. And all these secular reactionaries, you can tell that they have a religion deep down. The only way to make skin in the game work that I can tell is through memes and jeans. I guess we could create like financial schemes. In my distributism series, I have all these crackpot ideas. That's the reason why I haven't worked on this in earnest. I'm embarrassed at my crackpot political theories. I'm embarrassed. Some like academic agent, if I ever publish this or make a video on this, he's just going to smack me down. Because I know I have no background in economics, so I'm just spitballing here. You could come up with like newfangled ideas so that like you create future markets for people. So like a future market that pays out, you buy it for $1 and it pays out $50 if in 20 years the marriage rate has gone up by more than 10 points. And then you tax income out of rich people, but you don't tax those futures. So the net result is a huge market in artificial futures for metrics like the family, for metrics like educational achievement, that our capital class is forced to be heavily invested in, and therefore, but aside from those crackpot Ruth Goldberg economic schemes that I could dream up, if I could dream up, if I used drugs, they would be pipe dreams, right? But aside from those, the classic ways to keep elites loyal: blood, genetics, and religion. Pious leaders are needed, and we have to have a religion that connects the elites to the people they rule over. There's this quote from Curtis Yarvin or Mencius Moldbug that he said it once, and he said it in a context that was really stupid. But I haven't stopped thinking about this again and again, this quote, and he's really good at this. I don't even know if he meant anything by it. And I don't even know if I know what he meant by it. But maybe you guys could meditate on this quote, because he said, our elites are addicted to this Gnostic aristocratic philosophy of wokeism, and it makes them feel good because it makes them feel like good people, and that's what Gnosticism does, right? But in all of this, we've forgotten, in our quest to feel like good people, we've forgotten. They think that politics isn't about us, right? because they're going like, oh, well, I'm so powerful and I'm so rich and I'm so good that I don't even need to think about myself when I talk about politics. But ultimately, that's a function of privilege, because at the end of the day, politics is about us. My mother's generation, I live in a highly progressive area. And they're all in on this how horrible whiteness is and how horrible white privilege is. I mean, they don't think they're talking about their grandchildren when they say that. But whenever you talk about white privilege, you are that is your grandchildren, because politics is about us, and that's one thing that are the sensibilities of our elite religion have lost. Gnosticism separated the original Gnosticism separated man from the life he led. They said that your goodness has to do with knowledge and your aloofness, which is, when you think about it, that's the exact that seems to be at odds with Christ's actual mission, and that's why it was one of the original core heresies. Our modern wokeism is sort of a form of that, in that it says that somehow your interests in the future have to be at odds and separate from your own interests as a living biological organism. Your charity has to explicitly exclude yourself, and has to be hostile to the people who you have the largest responsibility to protect. And I think that the answer to your question, Emmett, is a better religion, a political religion that realizes that politics is about us. Guys, I have to call it. Just no more super chats. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your generosity, but I had to try to get through this, because otherwise I'm literally gonna. I've been going on for 3 hours now. Kiewich for New Zealand, $20. There's an Amish iteration here in New Zealand. They're much more hostile to the outside than the Amish in America, I take it. They've had a noticeable increase in attention from the shitlib industrial complex. Well, that makes sense, right? Because New Zealanders was not settled by Puritans; it was settled by Church of Englanders, right? So they don't have the ancestral or religious connection to these Anabaptists. They're weirdos by our modern standards, but I think they're much better than the alternative. That strategy might need a rethink, Dave. No, I'm not saying that you can make the Amish over again and get the same exception. The reason why the Amish work is that they're literally anthropologically related to the people who are the current wokies. Wokeism is an iteration of Christianity that descended most recently from Quakerism and Anabaptism and Puritanism, right? So that they've been grandfathered in. A new iteration of the Amish, where this relationship doesn't exist, would certainly not work. However, you could create an incentive to not screw with the parallelist community if, for instance, that parallelist community or that pacifist community stung really, really hard when you came into its territory, which is more or less what the ultra orthodox do in New York. So we have to work on. You don't have to defeat the shitlibs. You just have to make it so that they know that it hurts them more to attack you than the optics they get from it. Kit for $5. Replacement is bad, and we need genetic skin in the game. Well, I already said that. Yeah, I mean that's. We are a physical organism, right? Yet we need to avoid obsession with race, and race is not a Christian issue. Please elaborate. Well, I mean, it's fairly simple, right? I mean, the boundaries we have. I mean, like families, right? This is the stupid thing. Race is kind of like a family, right? So everyone knows families are transient, right? So like in 50 years, I'm not going to give you my family name, but in 50 years, the distributus family name is probably, I mean, in 100 years or 200 years, it probably will be destroyed, right? Because there'll be it's an uncommon name. There's a lot of people moving around. There's intermarrying, so on and so forth, right? But the genetics will still be there, right? There'll be some mixing. The boundaries will change, but the genetic lineage will still be there. The boundaries and coherency of a concept, like a genetic concept, like a family or a race, is mutable and transcendent and non-permanent. But the lineage, the line that it embodies, is very valuable and very important. The problem with a lot of things like, when you talk about replacement or colonization, is that there isn't a common lineage, or there isn't a meaningful common lineage. I mean, most white Americans have trace amounts of Native American, or a lot of white Americans have trace Native American blood in them. But it would be a lie to say that they were carrying on the lineage of Native Americans. That would be insulting to Native Americans. And I think when Elizabeth Warren attempts to do that, she's insulting that community. And so, I mean, lineage is important, but specific categories change over time. And the problem is when I see people like Spencer, and these people are race obsessed, they get into these ridiculous conversations about like, what is white? As soon as anyone asks that question, I'm out. I think it's sufficient to develop an understanding of Laura Towler has a better perspective on this. Like, I am British. I am this positive thing. She doesn't ask the question about who's in and who's out like at some social club. She just talks about the history and the actual culture that it embodies and the actual genetic lineage it embodies. And for that reason, I think I draw a distinction, and it's a subtle one, between valuing the ethnicity that you yourself inhabit and being obsessed with some kind of racial litmus. I know the devil's in the details here, but it really does, that the distinction really does matter, right? It's also important, and this is true for all Christians, you can love your own ethnicity. You can't hate anyone else's ethnicity. Those are the rules if you're a Christian, right? I don't think, do I even need to say that? I don't know. And that's another thing that I think, right-wingers always need to remind themselves that there are no ethnicities. All ethnicities are things that they're all beautiful flowers. The boundaries of those flowers are temporary, and they will evolve into new flowers over 1,000 years. But it's much easier to smash than it is to restore and preserve. And as much as I admire the ancient European empires that colonized the world in a lot of ways, I mourn the indigenous cultures that they destroyed. There's a large amount of human knowledge that we lost in that destruction. And I have no problem acknowledging that, right? User not found for Australian $20. Thank you very much. Dave, thanks for the content over the years. Why do many intellectual types look at self-reliant folks with contempt? Basic skills like machining, welding, mechanical, and electrical work is something you pay to get done now. Well, I mean, there's so many answers to that. This is, let me what you're really asking is, why do, in the sort of neo-reactionary case division, there are the Brahmins, which are the intellectual types, the Messiah, which are the independent types, the Red Americans, the Helots, which are the workers, again, mostly imported workers, and then the Dalits, which are the underclass, right? And right now we have a Brahmin-Dalit alliance. with Helots is kind of also in that alliance, but kind of potentially wavering. And you're asking, why do Brahmins hate Visenya? Well, Brahmins hate Visenya because Brahmins hate Visenya and Brahmins hate Optimates because they know that at any time they could be replaced by those people. And so to cement their own privilege, they ally with the underclass because they know that the underclass can never replace them. There's no possibility that the underclass could ever replace them because they don't have the education or the independence to. They're dependent. They can't even rule themselves, so they can't threaten the intellectual class. If we had a healthier society, the middle class and the upper class and the intellectual class would be in alliance with each other to elevate everyone at once. But instead, what happens is that we have a cynical elite that wants to keep people dependent, because once people are dependent, they know that they'll never be able to threaten their job security or to threaten their political position. And I find that very, very cynical. And that's one of the reasons why, and that's the main reason why I consider myself right-wing. Okay, great. So thank you very much. Sorry, I'm getting really tired, guys. I'm trying to get through this. Catholic convert for $2. Move to Dallas, third biggest metropolis and economy. Well, man, if I was going to move anywhere, I'd probably be moving to Austin because that's got all of the jobs. Maybe I get like an engineering job. I mean, is Dallas East Texas, right? If anything, Houston would be easier, right? Houston's where all the big oil plants are. Well, okay, I'll take it. I'll take your suggestion under advisement. I mean, the dream would be to move to Montana and sort of farm, wouldn't it? I mean, I don't know. That's something you just fantasize about, right? Just starting a new life in the sticks. I don't know how you'd make money. Maybe you could work as a coder, completely remotely, and then just fly into Silicon Valley. It might happen, right? I heard people doing that actually recently. I heard that there's a new class of people that live in the sticks and they fly in once a month to have meetings. Right flag for $25. Would you invite your father to stream with you? He could talk about Grace Kelly, the Danube Swabians, and liberalism. Well, it's funny you mentioned that, right flag, because I am editing my 3-hour my father's autobiography in video form. Right as we speak. That's actually retarded a lot of my video making because I really need to dedicate more time to editing his videos than to work on my stupid YouTube hobby. But it looks really good. I like it a lot. I fantasize about making a version of that for YouTube and then uploading that as a guest video. I would have to make a director's cut though, because there's so much personal information and there's so much information about people in World War II that may still be alive and that had various affiliations with losing sides in World War II. And you know how this goes, right? And in this environment, I'd have to really, really edit it down and really, really make sure that there's no evidence. And then I could release it as, probably at that point, it would be like an hour video. That might actually really be interesting to people, That might be really interesting. I don't know. I'd have to make that relies on me making the first cut first though. So I don't know. I would expect to see some, okay. It's up to his discretion if he wants to release it. But if he gives me permission to release his memoirs to the public, I could release something like that. I would imagine it would be sometime in 2021. Since it's already recorded. Orville 99999 for $20. Well, thank you very much. I'm late to the party, he says, but we have discussed Curtis Yarvin's review of Bronze Age mindset. Any thoughts on his theory that culture is downstream from art and that to win the culture war, we need artistic movements? I love that essay by Bronze Age Pervert, about Bronze Age Pervert from Yarvin. As a matter of fact, let me pull it up here. I'm doing Bronze Age Pervert Curtis. Was that in the American Mind? Okay, hold on here. Oh, it's the deep state. It's called the deep state versus the deep right, right? Okay, so there's a quote from this that I really loved. Um, okay, so okay, so he says, like his ancestor Nietzsche, Bronze Age Pervert is not for this, for that, or against the other thing. His book, this is Curtis Yarvin speaking. His book is like a lecture. His book is less like a lecture and more like a fire. It does not teach, it burns. It is not words, but an act. And it has no message, but it does have a theme. And the theme of Bronze Age mindset is the smallness of the modern world, in mind, in space, and in time. The mainstream mind looks at its own bubble through a fisheye lens. The bubble is almost everything. All of outer space, all of history is a tiny black fringe around it. The fringe, of course, is entirely uninhabitable. And if all errors of so basically what he says in this essay, and I should stop trying to read during a live stream. I apologize for that. It's amazing because what he's saying is that the rest of the world is so much more than our present age. And our present age is shrinking every single day. Every single day, the wokeism is contracting the culture around us. But that only means that their ability to puncture it with art is increasing in its power. The theme of Bronze Age mindset is the smallness of the modern world, and by that we mean the smallness of the modern mind. Before any cultural work can be done, that needs to be punctured, and that can only be punctured in art. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Bronze Age Pervert, but I think Curtis Yarvin's absolutely right about that, and that's where we need to start with our latest efforts, if we possibly can. But thank you for mentioning that. I had half a mind to read The Deep State versus the Deep Right on stream. Okay, whoa. I think I'm done with the super chats. Let me check the Google, because I'm really looking to end this thing. Give me a second here. Czech Republic, John Elridge, Pragmatic Culture, Bernays, I did that, Amish. Sorry guys, I'm just trying to kill time. I think this looks like we're almost, not trying to kill time, I'm trying to read through, make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, yeah, I think I got everything, guys. So with that being said, if I didn't miss a super chat, I'll give a little bit of a last 5 minutes of talk in case I absolutely missed a super chat. But thanks for watching this pretty long live stream. I didn't comment on the debate stream at all. But hopefully I've given some ideas to you in doing this. I really would like to have I would really like to have a live stream next time that is more laid back, I think. That would be nice. I thought for a while that maybe doing one on the Devil's Dictionary, I thought might be interesting. That would be a good laid back live stream. It certainly wouldn't be a 2-hour lecture. I should really stop doing those things, but I can't. Brevity is an art that's continuously escaped me to this point in my life. I hope to capture it sometime later, but whatever muse is responsible for that certainly has never gifted me with her presence. My next video is certainly going to be on... So I want to restart... So, and also with the inspiration of the Franklin, I've decided to restart my culture war and content creation series. That's more or less kind of like an advice thing, an advice series. And this video will be on what advice I would give to a 21-year-old me. So if whenever you're in your 30s, you always look back and you want to give advice to your 20-year-old self. So I'm going to try to do that and target it at a 21-year-old me who was growing up in present year. Now, obviously, I can't give general advice to 21-year-olds, only to people who are like me. So men who are middle class, who have a reasonable prospect for higher education ahead of them, and who are intellectually curious, which I think is more or less my audience to begin with. I probably would give very, very bad advice to women, although maybe there's something you can discern from it. I know I have a Shrek video that's out. I recorded half of that and then I put it down, and I kind of got stuck on the second half. There's this phenomenon called content constipation, which is the further you are from having the idea, the longer it takes you to record. Now, I absolutely will finish that video, but it's going to take a long time. I've never once hyped a video and not been able to finish it. But please, guys, be patient. That being said, it's really, really late here, so I will say Auf Wiedersehen, and I hope everyone had a great evening, and I will be able to stream sometime in the near future. I don't see any super chats that I missed, so I will end the stream here. Have a wonderful night and a blessed rest of the week.